Warning, the Stone Age Gamer includes a lot of bad language. Cover your mother***ing ears.
Good evening and welcome to the Stone Age Gamer Podcast. I am Kris Randazzo and joining me tonight is Old Game Compilation Dan Ryan.
It's just, there's so much inside me.
Dan and I had a chance to sit down and chat with Stephen Frost from Digital Eclipse to talk about Ninja Turtles Cowabunga Collection, Atari 50, and a whole lot more. Does anyone do retro game collections better than Digital Eclipse? Get your retro goggles on because the Stone Age Gamer Podcast starts now.
Oh wait, I suppose I was supposed to let them hear the interview for the answer. Sorry.
Hi, everyone. This is episode 421, and it's the week of July 29th, 2022. And, how you doing, Dan?
Hot. I'm hot, Kris.
Yeah. I'm hot. This is a different recording time for us than usual. It's the middle of the day on a Saturday, and that's because we did this interview with Mr. Frost from Digital Eclipse. They're the company behind some of the best retro compilations in the industry, and we talked to him for a long time. He was a very good sport. He answered all of our questions to the best of his ability. It was a fantastic interview. It is a beefy one, but boy, was I was enthralled the entire time.
Yeah, no, it was great. It was great. He was very lovely, very fun to talk to. He's a wonderful dancer. Just an all-around good guy.
All right, so without further ado, this is our interview with Stephen Frost from Digital Eclipse. Enjoy. All right, so we are here talking to Stephen Frost from Digital Eclipse. Steve, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do at Digital Eclipse?
Sure. I am the head of production over at Digital Eclipse, and we are a studio development studio focused on, a lot of the preservation and re-releasing of compilations based off of classic IP. We also do sort of upgraded kind of remakes, such as the Medieval. We did a Medieval kind of remake, which is a classic game for all you PS1 fans. And we do demakes as well and things like that. But our DNA is sort of utilizing classic IP and sort of bringing that to modern platforms and kind of adding quality of life and features that appeal to hopefully modern gamers. But we're just a bunch of passionate people who've been in the industry for a long time. And, we love games in general, and hopefully our passion and excitement for the IPs and the games come across in the releases that we make.
It certainly has in my experience. I've very much enjoyed your work up to this point, and I went back and looked through some of the older ones, going back to the PS1 era of the Atari, the arcade classics collections. There was like a Midway one and stuff. Digital Eclipse did those too.
Yeah, that's the early days. Digital Eclipse, that was before my time, but Digital Eclipse was sort of the first people out there with kind of like commercial emulation, in a physical retail project. I think that's really one of our claims to fame. That was, we kind of started that trend to a degree, and then the brand kind of disappeared a little bit as this company grew and became part of a larger group of studios and stuff like that. But it kind of came back around with Mega Man Legacy Collection, some years back, and we kind of just grown bigger from there.
That's fantastic. Legacy Collection is fantastic, and those old collections from back in the old days. That was the first time I was able to play. It was the first time I was ever properly able to hear the music for Paperboy. The arcade Paperboy is so good, and I have the NES one. The music is so pulled back for the NES version, and here
comparatively to the arcade, you make a lot of sacrifices on the NES, unfortunately.
All right, so I want to start by talking about Atari 50 because, I'm a Turtles nut, but I think somehow I'm even more excited about this Atari collection because I have most of the Turtles games. There's a lot of Atari stuff here that looks like it's being uncovered for the first time for wide audiences, and I think that's just beyond spectacular. So how did Digital Eclipse land this project, and how did this whole Atari 50 thing come about?
Well, we have a couple of folks, a lot of folks, but, Mike Micah, who's our sort of president / studio head, is a huge Atari head. That's his growing up, that era was his thing. And if you ever see his office or at home, he has just a large, immense collection of classic games and retro hardware. A lot of us do, but he's got especially the Atari stuff, and it's always been an era that he's been especially fond of. I think all of us really enjoy the early days because there wasn't any smoke and mirrors, what I call smoke and mirrors during that generation. And what I mean by that is that the gameplay had to be good, right? You had to fill in the rest with your imagination, but there weren't fancy cutscenes or FMV or visual effects and things like that. It was really down to the gameplay, and it really required, a good sense of design and what is fun. So there's a sort of an odd simplicity that kind of resonates on that stuff, and theoretically makes those games kind of timeless, even though obviously graphics and visuals have improved dramatically since then. So with the industry in general and the games industry in general, we know a lot of people. We're always out there talking to companies, and I think, hopefully, knock on wood, our name always kind of comes up when there's any discussion of like anniversary stuff or celebrations or emulation or retro IPs. And Atari was coming up to a big anniversary of them, which is the 50th anniversary, which is huge for any company that they reach that. I mean, that's a staggering number of years to be existing in this industry, and they've been around since sort of the beginning. And we obviously have been following their sort of resurgence and growth, and Wade taking over, and how the company has restructured and the things that they're doing. And so when they started thinking about like, well, we've been digging out some of this old IP, we've been releasing them as sort of this recharge series, and we're trying to rejuvenate stuff. We released the VCS, but we really need to have a product that not only kind of includes the greatest aspects of Atari's gaming history, but also informs people and teaches people. Because while a lot of older folks have grown up with Atari and know Atari, there is obviously whole other generations that haven't played many Atari games as far as a classical sense. They know the brand because it's always showing up in retro T-shirts and things like that, but they don't know much of why Atari was important and how it got started and things like that. And I think one of the great things that we sort of do is we don't just throw a bunch of games into a box. We try to also inform people why those games are important and why they deserve to be in a collection that's released nowadays. So I think, as a lot of people have looked at some of our past collections, and I think Atari did too, and they saw sort of the work and the depth that we go in order to gather information and present what we call sort of the criterion or museum kind of presentation for these properties. And they wanted something big for their 50th, and so it kind of, the dominoes fell into place, and we kind of got in contact with each other and came up with a plan to sort of create something that hopefully is special, that is representative of the history of Atari, but isn't just a collection. A lot of times collections get a bad rap because depending on who's doing it, it could just be, a variety of games thrown into a box with a bit of artwork and they call it a day. But Atari really wanted something to educate and inform and really show the vastness of the history over the 50 years. And
kind of like the difference between Mega Man Legacy Collection 1 and 2.
Yeah, exactly.
Not to poke fun at the one that you guys didn't do, but it's like, it's night and day, the difference between the care put into that first one and then playing the second one. It's like, well, I'm glad I have these games, but I really wish Digital Eclipse did the second one.
Yeah, it is interesting. Like, companies can do whatever they want with their IP, but it is interesting the number of companies that will get us to do stuff or look at what we do and not quite get it and try to replicate it, but they don't quite understand sort of what we do. But, going back to the Atari collection, I think, Atari did understand what we did. They knew that, we were going to be the guys to go in and dig through stuff and find people to interview and sort of a great match. And I think our passion kind of came through, and that sort of was the genesis of what it was going to be. Going into it, when we started this, though, we didn't we never expected how big it would grow as far as the structure of it and how the historic timelines were going to happen. Because normally in the past, the games were sort of the front and center of our collections. Like if you go into a collection, generally the first thing you see are the games. Mm-hmm. In this collection, the games have been most of the games have been released a lot, in the flashback series and various releases and stuff like that. People kind of know the games, especially if you're an Atari fan, you know the games. So they aren't as, magical and need to be in your face right away. So for this collection, really when you go into it, it's the historic aspects, the timelines, the museum content that is in front and center. You can access the games anytime you want to by button press, but really the first thing you go into this collection you see is the history, and that's where we want you to start to learn about it. So that's kind of like I said, the genesis of how this all came together.
So I love everything that you're saying there. It's making me really, really even more excited about this collection. But you talk a lot about historical context, which I think is super important for Atari. So I grew up on the 2600 before I got my NES, and how have you handled explaining some of the older games that did stuff like relied super heavily on their instruction manuals and stuff for context? Because, say, the average player today who's never played an Atari before picks up something like Asteroids and whatever, you blow up the asteroids, that's fine. But if you pick up something like Adventure, you're not really going to have any idea what you're even trying to do in that game, let alone something like Sword Quest. So beyond historical significance on like just the game itself being historical, how have you handled anything as far as like trying to explain the context of what it was like to play this game and try to make it so that, like, are there any sort of tutorials added to make it so that newer players can understand some of these seemingly kind of obtuse games by today's standards?
Right. So it's sort of a combination of stuff depending on the games. We obviously try to add quality of life or make things easier for people. So in the context of like, an adventure, for example, obviously it has a significant presence in the timeline. And so we like to, when you go to the timeline, we're going to give you a bit of background about adventure. Why is it important? It gets a little bit of a space on the timeline to dictate that. But the resources that you have for the game, such as the manual and stuff like that, can all be accessed from the pause menu. So you can bring up the manual at any time, and that's sort of especially important into relation to, like you said, Sword Quest. The comics and the manuals are accessible at any time so that you can refer to them. And so we try to make it easy for people to be able to pop stuff up and look at it and things like that. We also, feature things like customizable controls to make it easier for people if you hate the configuration of how things are and you want to adjust it so you can play it in a different way. But even the manual perspective, if you think about it, was kind of painstaking because
absolutely,
we don't have all the manuals for every game just sitting around. So we either have to. Mike has a lot. Between all of us, we have a lot of them, but they still have to be found. They have to be scanned. They have to be kind of cleaned up. So the amount of artwork in this collection was staggering. Norm was one of our artists there, and he's just working endlessly. He worked endlessly through this project to try to clean stuff up and 4K, scanning stuff to 4K because the more modern consoles handling 4K, and people want to see the stuff in 4K assets. So these start to balloon up in size and things like that, and the clarity that you need to have in 4K assets. But, just generating manuals and creating manuals for all this stuff took a long time in cleaning it. And then you get to a point where you're like, we've got finally manuals for all the games, but we also have the new games, like Sword for Air World and things like that. What do we do there? So we created manuals for those as well to mirror that whole idea for consistency. So all of the new games, Vector Sector, Haunted Houses, all that stuff, all have their own. Vector Sector doesn't, I don't think, because that's sort of like an arcade kind of homage thing. But the other games all have sort of manuals that were generated to kind of replicate that. And again, all these things are accessible through the pause menu. So and we can dive into deep, but like even like the minutia of detail about the analog controls for these games and how you can adjust them. We spent so much time trying to get the vector games and how they glow and the vector lines. Like I feel that you could look at anything aspect of this, and I don't want to toot our own horn, but like, you know, like the vector games, outside of the original arcade games, there's no more accurate representation of the vector games ever, like in existence. You know, we have the most cycle accurate Jaguar emulation that's ever been done. You know what I mean? You know, the Lynx stuff is amazing. So it's all these little details. And even being able to switch how you want your analog controls and the type of analog and the sensitivity of the analog, and you invert it if you want to invert it, like all these things that people don't necessarily think about when they see a collection like this, like, oh, it's just, you know, Atari 2600 games, whatever, we've seen that all. But individually, there's just so much, you know, detail, like, and I don't want to, you know, you have a lot of questions, Sandra, but like even like the bezels and like, you know, does the bezel need to overlay the image, or is it behind the game in the arcades? You know, how does it overlap? You know, are there lighted buttons for some of these games, like the little volcano buttons? Like, how do we represent that? And can we make them light up? And so, just every iota of this collection is very much passion, and we just kept building up. And I've tweeted this before, but like, you know, when we started this, we didn't know how many games we were going to have in it. It's a weird thing for a Digital Eclipse collection, because normally from the get-go, we're like, okay, these are the games that we're going to have. There might be some additions that kind of go and grow as we go through the collection, but predominantly it's locked at the beginning. This one, since we knew that the historical context and just the timelines and stuff were going to be the very important and focus of this collection, we had to be more flexible, and we had to add games as we felt that they were important and could add to the story. So the collection grew from, you know, a decent number of games to now over 100 during development. So it's
over
considerable.
100, you say?
Yes, over 100. Yes.
Oh, the trailer said over 90, so now there's more.
I kind of tweeted. Yeah, I tweeted something just recently where I said, you know, kind of doubling down on my previous tweet, which was like, you know, this collection kept growing during development, and it kept growing, and so, you know, even
that's exciting.
You know, even beyond that, it's now over, you know, 100. So that's in a roundabout way. Hopefully that answered your question. But to get back to it, yeah, the manuals and stuff are easily accessible. We try to provide. You know, even like the arcade bezels have like the instructions that they have on there from the arcades and things like that. So hopefully the point of entry for people who aren't familiar with this, fans, between the context of the timelines and the manuals and other materials, will help them to be able to jump in and play this stuff.
Excellent.
That's crazy. Like, that's just insane. I'm really curious how you got to right, because you're saying like games are growing and whatnot. The one to me that like really sticks out is finishing up Sword Quest.
Right.
Like getting Air World in there, that's bananas. Right. Like, was that a definitive, we're doing this Atari collection, we have to finish this series? Oh my God, we have to finish this. Or was that just something that kind of came up like, wouldn't it be cool if?
Yeah, I think it starts out like that a bit, where like you at the beginning you try to be a little bit more realistic, and you're like, okay, you know, we want to do these games, collect these games, we want to have historical sort of presence for them, and you know, where does it go from there? But then it kind of grew into that. It's like, wow, you know, the key mantra for this collection is that it can't just be a collection, it's a celebration.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And how do we do that? How do we differentiate that to people? And the way we sort of do that is you need to add in new content and quality of life stuff. And so we quickly, going into this, we kind of knew that we were going to create some new games. And the individuals who worked on these, you know, are all passionate about specific aspects of Atari's history. Jeremy was really focused on sort of the vector stuff. He loves that vector aesthetic of the old games, and so he worked on an homage to that in vector sector, and it kind of organically grew. You know, Mike is a big fan of combat, and who isn't a big fan of combat? It was the de facto kind of game, right, for the Atari platform, and so he wanted to modernize combat and also the tank arcade game back in the day, and like, how do you take these kind of experiences and modernize them? And that's where Quadra Tank kind of came out of. So these things all kind of organically grown. You know, Dave always liked the concept of haunted house. He was like, how can I make an improvement to Haunted House, how would it be improved? And Haunted Houses came out of that. So Sword Quest is always something when you talk about Atari, that's always kind of like that pin and on the board that's like, Air World is that oasis, right? It's that thing.
Where's the sword?
Yeah, exactly. It's the legend that was announced, Todd Fry back in the day, and we're like, oh, how great would it be? And so we kind of started working on this half-heartedly, expecting that there's no way Atari would say, okay, you can release Air World,
right?
But I think we were able to convince them by showing them the passion and the whole research that we went to into the sort of the Agent Zodiac stuff, and based off of the notes of Todd back in the day of how this would work. And they're like, wow, a lot of thought went into this, and actually makes sort of a logical progression, and it sort of makes sense. The nervous aspect of it, and I'm sure we'll have pictures we'll post later, is that Todd Fry did come by, and we were part of interviews, right? As interviews, because he's one of the interviews, and we were like, well, do we show him Air World? Like, how do we do this? Because we may not be able to include it and stuff like that. But to his credit, he sat down and he played it, and he really, really enjoyed it. I think he appreciated that we were taking something that he put sort of his heart and soul into, and never, the last game never got completed. And to see it up and running in this manner, I think there's a great picture of him and some of the other guys. And he's smiling, and he's so happy to see it, which was a heartwarming moment, I think, for all of us.
I was going to say, that's got to be so fulfilling as a developer, producer, maker of games to help this guy kind of realize his dream. That's really, really cool.
Yeah, get those last steps across the finish line. That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you do this, I think we try to make the original creators, happy. If I digress a little bit, and I go back to sort of our Disney collection, where we did kind of the final cut of Aladdin, which was the whole idea of when we were interviewing the Aladdin team, the original Aladdin team, they kept saying stuff like, oh, if we only had more time to do this, or if I had time I would have done this. And so I started thinking, after we got those interviews, I started sitting there, I'm like, well, we do have time. So
as a matter of fact, we now have
time. And so that was the impetus of going through and doing the final cut, which is us, Digital Eclipse, taking all of the comments and would have beens and wishes we could haves, and making the definitive version of Aladdin, as it would have been if day one patches existed back in those days, right? But you manufactured a cartridge, that was it was done. So we fixed a lot of stuff and balanced stuff and things like that. And so, whenever we can do that to deliver on the original creator's sort of intent and get their blessing, is just a win-win. It's an amazing feeling. But yeah, Air World is one of those surreal kind of things. I'm glad that we're able to kind of conclude, that epic saga. And, even though, it's been, some 30, 40 years of announcing it and now coming to completion, but, we did it. And so, kudos to the team for working on that.
That's so cool.
So my question about Air World, the previous Sword Quest games are not exactly masterpieces in a lot of ways. I find them way more fascinating than I do fun to play.
Sure.
Was the approach to making Air World more to match the previous games, or were you trying to take what was being gone for, the original intent of these games, and try to make it more fun on a modern sense? Which direction did you really go with getting Air World together?
Right. I mean, it's a different era, different sensibilities of what when games are developed now versus then. Todd obviously had specific goals, and if you really look at Sword Quest, it was kind of this weird combination of action and adventure, right? And kind of the first ones really of its time. So I think organically when you develop stuff now, what you consider quote unquote fun is going to be different than 30 odd years ago. So I think we try to integrate elements and features that we consider fun from an aesthetic like today that people will enjoy doing. But there's also the key focus of the mystery and the unknown of what made the first three games kind of these interesting pieces, right? Of like, oh, there's this maze and you're going through and I'm trying to find stuff, but there's a little bit of unknown and I need to look at the instruction manual and things like that to help me. So we tried to capture that. But I think just organically, because so much time has come, when we're designing this stuff, hopefully, what is considered quote unquote fun in modern times now resonates right with this, and that it's a bit more of a experience that more people beyond Atari fans will want to play and see the conclusion of and things like that. So we didn't try to make it hard or anything by just to make it hard and stuff like that. I think we wanted to make the individual sort of action segments and the exploration fun naturally, but it was important to kind of keep that mystery and a little bit of like putting the puzzles together and how does this all connect together. That felt really important to maintain as well.
So here's an interesting question. Atari's been doing these Atari XP games where they've been having these physical cartridges for the Atari 2600 of like newly announced games. Would Sword Quest Air World function on a 2600? And could it theoretically be put in a cartridge to complete the Sword Quest saga on the actual 2600?
It would take a little bit more work to do it. Like, we followed a lot of the 2600 rules. There's both like a regular and there's kind of like an enhanced version. So like the regular version is more akin to like what the traditional 2600 experience is, and then the enhanced one adds embellishments and things that weren't possible in the 2600. So yes, I mean, we could definitely probably convert it over to a 2600 cart, but it runs on a different engine in a different platform sort of scenario. But the rules as far as how it was made and stuff like that, we tried to stick as close to like the limitations of the 2600 and how it worked in general as best we could. So I imagine that if Atari ever wanted to bring it over, it wouldn't be a monumental undertaking, I guess is what I'm saying. It could be done.
That's awesome. I know there's a lot of lunatics like me that would love to have an actual functioning Air World cart. I don't have Water World. I have complete for the first two, Fire and Earth, but I've never tracked down a Water World because that thing's expensive.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think it's just one of those things where the further you go down, they probably made less and less, right? And
that was like only available through a catalog or something.
Right.
So
right.
Of course, that one's rare. I wanted to back up a little bit. You talked about the art that's in this collection, and Atari art has always been an enormous source of fascination for me. You mentioned that it's massive. So I got a couple of questions about it. How did you handle stuff like alternate box art for Atari games? Does each one have one box art? And if that's the case, like which one did you go with? Because I know in a lot of Atari merchandise, you'll see like Yar's Revenge. Here's the art for Yar's Revenge, but it's a silver box. And like, well, nobody had the silver box one. The orange one was the one that everybody had. That's the common one. So why are they promoting that? How did you choose which box art was associated with the games when you choose them in your menu system? And is there any attention paid to carts that had multiple variations, like the different box arts, or even the cartridges themselves? Some were just text, some had pictures, etc.
To answer your question, I think we tried to go with sort of what is considered quote unquote, at least for like the timeline aspect, like what is quote unquote considered like the de facto box. You know what I mean? There are a lot of times in how the timeline works. The timeline is sort of like obviously the horizontal aspect to it, but it also goes vertically, and sometimes it goes very deep. And so there's key elements of the timeline where you can dive deeper into it, like adventure, like I talked about adventure, right? Adventure is kind of a big presence on the timeline. What are the aspects of adventure that we want to include? And there's galleries and things like that. So depending on it, stuff like that could show up in sub galleries, right? So that we could show that stuff and things like that. But generally, we try to kind of pick out the sort of we consider the de facto box cover. Also from an aesthetic perspective, because when you're scrolling through all the games, you don't want to have all these variations at least show up from, when on the main game selection screen. You want them to be consistent, and that way you can also see when it transitions between platforms and stuff like that. So I guess to answer your question, in some cases, I'm sure it probably could show up in sub galleries and things like that. But as far as the main boxes, it was, I think we kind of just determined what is the main, the de facto main box that people are aware of and are most familiar with, and use that. And we even went in for the bonus games and generated box covers, our own box covers, to sort of match the aesthetic. So everything has box covers because it's like a long carousel that you can sort through the games and skip between platforms. So all of them have manuals. Even the sort of what we call the reimagined games, and then we also requested, like, we include some homebrew stuff like Yoomp, which is an awesome game. Awesome. And we also got, they actually generated a box, and we took those boxes and put them in there. And also, this is a thing where the footage on the trailer is actually kind of older footage of the timeline. It's very early. You can tell because if you look in that, you can kind of see that there's very early scans of boxes. They're even folded. They're not like proper boxes. They're kind of flattened. That was just sort of the first phase of stuff. But actually, if you go into the product now, the boxes are 3D models. So you can actually rotate them.
Oh, that's cool.
That's fun.
You can rotate them and look at the back, the up and sides or whatever like that. So we thought that was like a neat thing. So again, that's a classic example of, like, as we're going along, like, you have box scans and you're like, these are cool. People view them. Oh, sorry, I got someone in the unfortunately mowing the lawn next to me. We start with that, and then, like, how can we improve it? And how can we improve it? And that's really this project as a whole is like, we have an original vision, and then every aspect of it is how can we improve it? How can we improve it? How can we improve it? And so the end product is dramatically different and substantially bigger and, and more polished than even what our lofty goals were from the beginning, which is awesome. But yeah.
So how did you handle some of the, I know these things have popped up in Atari collections before, but since this one's being so extensive, how did you handle stuff like Pele soccer versus championship soccer, or fun with numbers versus basic math? Or is basic math even on here because it's just a calculator, I guess? But games with multiple titles that are the same game, how did you handle stuff like that?
Excuse me. So I think we chose, like, in those cases, there's no reason to fill it up with, like, this basically the same game. So I think we chose what we considered, or I think with Atari's obviously blessing, what is the de facto version, kind of like the boxes, and we go with there. And I'm really sorry about this noise, unfortunately, that is happening right now. I don't know if you guys can hear it or not. Oh, okay, that's great.
No,
okay, well, then I won't apologize. Then I won't apologize. So yeah, I mean, we didn't really include, like, on the same platform, the same kind of game, just because it doesn't really make sense. Really, what we wanted to do is as part of the sort of museum stuff, call out specific games and include those. And that doesn't mean that we don't have the same game across multiple platforms. In some cases, that's very useful because people can see, an arcade version versus a home version versus, like a 2600 version versus a 5200 version, and how are they different and things like that. So we didn't do that a ton because, not all versions are, they're either very close or they don't have enough differences to warrant it and things like that. So we're very, I say curated, but we're very careful with sort of the games that are included and why they're there. But there are key games or franchises that are so big that you need to include a number of them in order to be able to kind of see their progression throughout history and their sort of differences. But to kind of answer your question, per platform, we just chose what is considered the main sort of game, and that's kind of how we progressed.
So I guess specifically, can you answer, is it in the game, is championship soccer for 2600, or is it Pele soccer? I mean, they're the identical game, just was rebranded with Pele after it released originally. So, like, does Pele cost money at this point to have the name on the box, or is that game even in there?
I assume so. That's something that you run across in anything, right? So we wouldn't include. I'm trying not to list all the games and keep people surprised at what games there are and things like that. But Pele's we wouldn't include. But let's say that's not to say that we would include another version, or there's other clever ways of doing it. And I'll give you a hint from the perspective of, Indy 500. Indy 500 would be difficult to get the Indy license these days, and probably not worth it. We feel that's a important game still, to a degree, and wanted to include it, so we figured out a way to do that, and I will just let you think about what that might be. So there's a lot of kind of juggling around that stuff, but we try to avoid the license stuff. These games, just in general, older games, especially 30, 40 years old, because it's, you're trying to confirm who owns this stuff and things like that, and Atari has gone through a lot of company shifts and new personnel. So there's a lot of time that's just spent does Atari really own this? Or does someone else own this? Who owns this? This is especially true of Lynx games, Jaguar games, and things like that, that you might think, are Atari owned, but they're not Atari owned now. So there's a big minefield of kind of going through and figuring out who owns what and things like that. And so due to that, we try to avoid situations that, who could you track down to it? Example, a Pele's, right? Who would you even reach out to and try to tackle to do that? And could you make sure, and the key thing is even if you reached out to a person, could you make sure that legitimately you could get the rights to do it? So that's the challenging aspect of a lot of these collections that we spend a lot of time doing, is just verifying this person owns this, we can use it. Who owns this piece of artwork? It's simple things that you don't think about, we thought Atari owned this artwork. No, someone else owns this artwork. Okay, well, who is this person? And can we get them to, so that's, I think, what we excel at in the the archaeological Indiana Jones stuff that I kind of bring up in a lot of times when I talk, but it's stuff that people don't really think about a lot. It's they just get art. And I'm well, where do we get art from? Or where do we get this from? Sometimes the publisher, like Atari or someone, will have stuff, or Cowabunga Collection, Konami had a bunch of stuff too. But a lot of times they give you 20% of what you need, and we need to get the other 80%. And so there's a ton of work that goes into tracking stuff down, prototypes of stuff, versions of games that are is this the correct version of the game that's out there, or is there an updated version that never got released, or whatever? There's all this stuff that you have to kind of investigate in the behind the scenes stuff that I don't think people really think about when they look at these collections. But
I can't just go on Google Images and just print whatever? That's not how that works? So weird.
I always find that sort of humor. It's you're you just threw some ROMs in a box. Okay, but ROMs in a box don't play themselves. You got to have an emulator, right? So who's going to build the emulator, right? Which is the hardest part of it. And then just grab some art where I'm okay. The internet artwork of this stuff that we need to blow up to 4K and clean is just going to work across these things. There's a tremendous amount of work that goes into this stuff,
especially if you want to do it right.
Right, exactly. So, in a roundabout way, hopefully that answered your question about that.
All right, I got one more art-related question.
Sure.
This is just a personal. One of my favorite things when I was a little kid, we first got our 2600. My favorite things were the old catalogs. Now, is any of that stuff included in here?
I think I'm trying to think specifically. Some of the stuff is big. I'm trying to think if that's some of the stuff that we kind of did some pages of, or things like that. I can't quite remember, because there's a bunch of content that in the end we're well, it doesn't add a bunch to the collection. We should probably not include it. It doesn't make sense to include it, but we try to include pages and stuff like that. So off the top of my head, I can't remember what we did with catalogs.
Okay.
So
I'll be surprised when it comes out then.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know if it's the case where we just maybe did selective pages or we end up not doing it. I'm not sure. We had so much stuff eventually where it was getting too much, and like it was becoming like, oh, does this really add to the story? I'm not saying catalogs in general, but there's other content that are like, does it really add to the story, or is it just a superfluous kind of bullet point that doesn't really impact stuff? So we tried to make sure that everything we included is somewhat meaningful in some way and kind of adds to the history and behind the story and stuff like that. So anyway.
Gotcha. So you had mentioned before getting different brands involved, specifically back to the 2600, but also on the 5200 to a degree. There's definitely some third-party content that's really important to the history of Atari. Now, I assume Activision stuff's not on there just based on what I saw in the trailer and the fact that Activision is such a different brand now. But the games that Atari made that were based on third-party properties, things like Space Invaders or more to the point, Pac-Man,
right.
That stuff's so important, like Defender is so important to the 2600 identity. Atari did those games. They're part of the color box labels and everything. Is anything like that included in this collection?
I mean, we obviously tried to pursue a lot of this stuff, but it's, the challenges of just like trying to get rights and reaching out to people and get clarity is just oftentimes just, it's too much and it's too nebulous. I'll give you an example of where, there's a couple times that we tried to get clearance for, even certain screenshots of third party, properties. Or the inclusion of like, a scan of an ad or something like that. And, at the beginning, it'll be like, this shouldn't be a problem. Is Atari okay with it? Yeah, Atari, totally Atari's okay with it. It just needs to get your approval. And then it's like, oh yeah, it shouldn't be a problem. And then 6 weeks go by. Like, even though you pressed it. And then 6 weeks, they're like, unfortunately, we can't give approval for this. Thanks. Right? So... And there's no context for it. You don't know why, and things like that. So, I mean, all I can say is that, we try as much as possible within the time constraints that we have. We work with Atari to try to get, permissions to include as much as we can, but we can't get everything. And there's also, like, even situations where you think you know who owns it and you talk to them, they're unsure that they own it. And because they're unsure that they own it because there's no one around, they can't say, yeah, you're fine, So that's part of the problem. It's not just, being able to say, can I have the rights to this or whatever. It's like the uncertainty because the people who are there now at these companies, they don't know for clarity. They try to dig through stuff in old contracts and blah, but they don't know for certain if they still own the rights to something. And so due to that, whenever there's a question, you can't just throw it in, you can't just include it, say, well, sure, okay, you may not be sure, but we'll include it. Like, you have to be a little bit more careful about that stuff. So all I can say is we tried to get a lot of stuff. Some of the things, like you were correct, Activision, there's no way we could have gotten that. But what I'm hoping for some of these third-party properties is that Atari 50 comes out, is a mind-blowing success, hopefully. It gets people to see like, oh, wow, this is doing really well. And, does it make sense to do DLC packs or updated content releases or things like that focus on specific things? I kind of look at like the, Evercade, how they kind of release this stuff, in particular themes and things like that. I could easily imagine us doing that. And that's a little bit more manageable because, like if we did like an Activision pack, you could just focus and say like, hey, Activision, these are X number of games. Let's spend the time to figure out the rights to this and try to get permissions to do this. But, with a project of this big that you're trying to focus on Atari stuff, you try to get as much in there, but there just isn't sort of enough time and oftentimes clarity enough to include everything that you want to, I guess is what I'm saying.
Right. And I assume that extends to stuff like Raiders of the Lost Ark or Superman or even E.T.
Yeah, those other properties are really tough. And we know, that they're important and things like that. The good thing is that we've sort of, in our kind of process of trying to figure out who owns the stuff, we've developed relationships and things like that, and are one step closer to potentially, like I said, in the future, if we do additional releases and things like that, we can try to include more of that stuff and spend more time just focused on getting, the rights to it. The technology is already built now, right? Which was the key thing. This collection has the most emulators and just new stuff generated than any of our past collections. I mean, if you think of all the platforms, all of these emulators, for the most part, probably like 90% of them are all new, built, for this collection. So that's, as you can imagine, is a huge undertaking. Just the Jaguar emulation is a huge undertaking. So, you get a bit of technical debt as far as how much time you need to spend just to get things up and running, that some other sacrifices have to be made and things like that. So I think that now that we have a platform for it, it exists and things like that, we can focus on potentially, is there a follow-up to this, or are there, additional packets or things like that where we can try to add even more of the games that people want to see, and provide even more historical context for those games.
Yeah, because it's stuff like, specifically Pac-Man and E.T. get such a terrible reputation, but
right.
I mean, when I was a kid, I loved those games. That was my first Pac-Man game. I didn't know the difference, and as its own thing in a vacuum, it's really neat. And that Pac-Man, was it the Pac-Man museum that just came out?
Right,
has that wallpaper that is from the artwork of the Atari box of it. So there's definitely some love for it out there, but.
No, it's true, and we try to mention this stuff as we can, like like the big dig for ET that some of our team members were at. Mike was at. We have photos. We include at least a photo or two of that dig in there. In the timeline, talking about that aspect of the big dig for the ET cartridges and things like that. So we definitely try to mention them as best we can. It's just sometimes, like I said, licensed rights, not just from, it's difficult enough from current scenarios, but like when you're trying to track down ownership of games from that long ago, it's challenging.
Yeah, it would be so cool to see like some sort of ET version, just to get more people to actually be able to play the game and explain why it is the way it is. Because I know Howard Warsaw he's talked about it a billion times, and there's kind of a core of an interesting game in there, especially given its historical context. So having it more accessible would be pretty wild. But obviously, understanding the limitations of these things is a big part of understanding why some things aren't there.
Exactly. And I equate it for I think it will open doors once people see the product. It's been in the past, things that you create stuff and then people see it and then they're like, oh, I trust these guys. I kind of equate to when I came in and I was doing Street Fighter and trying to get Capcom's trust to do Street Fighter, and then SNK saw the passion that we have for Street Fighter, and they entrusted us with the SNK 40th anniversary collection, which was a crazy amount of work to try to dig up some of those arcade boards. But that's the story for another time. But you know what I mean? Like, people see, and we're building, and I hope that continues, and then it makes future releases and being able to get rights to stuff and talk to bigger companies even easier and easier, in the future. That's my dream.
All right. You mentioned the Jaguar. I got a bunch of questions about that. I guess I don't have a bunch of questions about it. It's really just kind of a big question mark. I have a Jaguar. I love that thing, but I understand that I love it because I'm a crazy person. The Jaguar is not exactly looked upon happily by a lot of people. It's kind of junked on. I imagine, like you said, it's been a lot of work getting that up and running. Can you tell me a little bit about the process of getting Jaguar emulation working, and also a little bit, if you can, tell me more about how the game selection was made, because that was a more modern system with third-party stuff on it. When you think of the Jaguar, a lot of the big games you think of are like Alien versus Predator, which I can't imagine is on this collection because that's a lot of that's rights issues right there. But I did spot like Trevor McFur during that trailer. I spotted the box art for that in there. So like, that's not a great game, but what are you doing to convince people to at least understand why it exists and its historical context of something like Jaguar and Trevor McFur, or just Jaguar games in general?
Right. So a lot of stuff, the Jaguar emulation came out of sort of passion aspect. Rich Whitehouse was the evil mastermind that, I say evil, but he's kind of a very cool guy and kind of a genius. But he works, if you're not familiar with him, he works, he does a lot of stuff, but he's also part of the Video Game History Foundation, and he does a lot of their technical evaluations and investigations into prototypes and old hardware and things like that. So he's very, very cool guy. I love working with him. We've worked with him on a variety of other things. He's a ROM hacking guru and things like that. But his strange passion when we started this project, his dream that he thought he never would do, is like he wanted to always work on a Jaguar emulator. And I'm like, really? and he's like, well, there hasn't really been like a cycle accurate, like really dedicated Jaguar emulator, especially in a retail release, to get it to more people. I'm like, well, I mean, if you feel that that's something, and this was the early part, like when we were just starting to talk about the Atari 50, we didn't know what we were going to do yet, and even if we were going to include Jaguar, what era we were going to focus on and things like that. But he's like, I really want to sort of work on this. I'm like, okay, let's do it, and let's include Jaguar games. I have a Jaguar as well. I've played a vast assortment of Jaguar games, even more so now as we try to figure out control schemes that have worked with the large number of buttons and things like that, which is a whole other story. It's a whole other story.
That's an interesting controller. I'm very curious how those games are going to pan out.
It took a lot of iteration to figure out sort of the way we handle that. I won't reveal sort of how we do it, but I think it actually ends up being a bit of an intuitive way of handling stuff. Obviously, and I'm sort of like meandering here, but like, obviously a standard controller doesn't have that many buttons. That doesn't have the same number of buttons. So we had to come up with a way to make it easier for people to do certain things. And I think our solution, which you'll see, depending on if it's revealed before when the collection comes out, I think works. It's a nice balance, and the design of it and how it functions is intuitive enough for people to actually utilize and enjoy. So anyway, so Jaguar in general, so that's how it began. I will tell you that despite it being a more quote-unquote modern Atari platform, the rights ownerships questions for Jaguar games is amazingly nebulous. There's so many people who think they have ownership of games but don't really, or don't think they do have ownership but actually do have ownership, because we would research it. So it was a bit kind of crazy. I wanted to make sure, because initially, if I backtrack a little bit, the game that we knew we had to have on this collection was Tempest, right? 2K.
Right.
Like, it has to be on there. So I'm like, even bare bones, because we didn't know how long at the beginning, a Jaguar emulator was going to take. It took a while, but we didn't know. So I'm like, well, a way to maybe reduce risk and instead of building an emulator that works across all games, we focus on one that just works on one or two games, and one of them being Tempest, because that has to. So that was the number one focus, getting Tempest working. And I'm like, we know clearly that we can utilize Tempest. We have friendships with Atari, and we have friendship with Minter, so we're good. Like, we can do that. But the other stuff is nebulous, and I spent so much time trying to dig through the sort of Atari, the Jaguar library, and trying to figure out like what sort of makes sense. What are games that are somewhat easily approachable, or people know because they're traditional pack-ins like Cybermorph, right? what is a decent variety? Because it's like, as you say, most games on the Jaguar aren't the greatest, right? Like, they're curiosities, but most people in the world have never played a Jaguar game. You know, especially now, the cost of owning a system, cartridges, blah blah blah, is quite expensive. So, you know, let's see the pool of games that we can for sure get the rights to, and what is a decent variety of stuff that will try to touch different genres. So my main key thing was like trying to touch different genres. So, you know, Trevor McFur being a shooter kind of scenario, like more of like a, you know, side-scrolling traditional shooter, if you'd call it that. Whereas Strymomorph, of course, is sort of a pack-in. Tempest is very much like harkens back to the classic Tempest arcade. So I tried to have different genres represented. So if you're going to be exposed to the Jaguar, at least you can see a selection of different genres on the platform and get a better idea of what the system is. So that's how we kind of came about it. We kind of saw what was available, what we could for sure get the rights to between Atari and other groups. And then we sat down and said, like, okay, let's try to pull out games that represent as many of the different genres as we can and include them so that people have at least a bit of variety when they're going through this. So that was sort of how the selection process came to be.
All right, I have one specific game request question.
Sure.
Can you tell me...
Is it White Men Can't Jump?
No.
It's funny you say that because I have White Men Can't Jump. White Man Can Jump is not in the collection, but it is plugged into my Jaguar with a Jaguar tap. You know what I mean, for multiplayers. It's sitting right here to my left.
I'm shocked that you said Tempest 2K was the one that you built around and not White Men Can Jump.
You know, like I originally there was a lot of White Men Can't Jump jokes and I brought it up. Like I think that was the first. You may think this is strange, but like I think that was the first joking game that I said because I was playing it at the time early on. I was like, well, the game we have to have on here is White Men Can't Jump.
Obviously.
Yeah. So, but anyway, sorry to your question. What game were you?
Yeah.
No, it's no problem.
Is Flip Out on the collection?
Do I answer that? I'm trying to think of like, should I? I'm trying to like not go through all the lists because I don't know how much Atari wants to announce or what they don't announce and things like that.
It's the only one that I will directly ask you if that one's on the collection. I'll avoid anything else. Just it's probably my favorite Jaguar game. It's not a masterpiece. Few Jaguar games are, but like you talked about different genres. Like, well, puzzle games. Was it like that in Zoop? I can't think of any other puzzle games on Jaguar.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'll just say no. Unfortunately, it's not in there.
My heart.
Sorry.
Bummer.
Yeah. That one wasn't the one. But, you know, like, I'm hoping to do more Jaguar games. You know, now that we have a Jaguar emulator, I'm hoping to do more Jaguar games. I don't know. You know, maybe this would be weird because I don't know how well this would sell. It'd be more of just for specific fans, but like a Jaguar collection of some sort. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I did tease with Atari because people have mentioned this to me, but like now that we do have a solid emulator going, like, you know, why don't you guys release like a Jaguar Mini?
There you go.
You know, it's a curiosity thing.
We've definitely had
sure,
questions about that. I mean, at Stone Age Gamer, we sell the Jaguar Game Drive, which is
right, which is great.
Jaguar flash card. That thing
sells
sells way better than even we expected it to. Like it was. I mean, flash cards in general do pretty well, especially now because there's not.
Yeah, I have
not
a game drive. Yeah,
but
I have a game drive too. Yeah,
that thing sold out super fast and. Which was shocking to us, or at least me personally, because like how many people have Jaguars? Like you said before, they're hard to get. And then once that sold out, people are like, "Are you going to add Jaguar CD support? Like for what?" But I guess, but there's a lot of people that want. Like, as few people have played Jaguar, even fewer have played Jaguar CD, right?
Yeah.
So there's definitely a market out there and a curiosity for that system. I mean, heck, if Night Trap can sell over and over again, anything's possible, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. I joke with them about that. But I suggest things all the time to them, and sometimes they go with it, and sometimes they don't. But yeah, you sort of, especially if you're getting a Jaguar now, you kind of have to have a game drive because the cost of games is so prohibitive. The cost of 2 games is like the game drive. It's like it's a little bit crazy, but those sort of things are very useful for us because we can kind of go through and, even from a development perspective, right? Like compare how it works on we work on something and how it works on original hardware and things like that. But I'm glad that we got Jaguar. Lynx, has been out there a little bit, but still most people have not played Lynx, know? And it was the same, boat. Like, we tried to get a decent number of games sort of on Lynx, but Lynx is also, it's just really unfortunate that the ownership of a lot of these properties is really unknown. And I've run across folks who, say that they we own the rights to this, and they don't. They honestly don't.
That's interesting.
There's a couple times that's happened, and thank goodness we didn't go down that route because, we figured it out later. But there's a lot of just like cases where I feel that people just include stuff or sell stuff and just hope that nothing happens, that no one comes after because they're instead of permission. Because they aren't selling a bunch, they aren't selling a ton, so it's kind of beneath the radar and things like that. But there's definitely folks out there who think they own stuff and they do not. So.
All right, so we've spent a lot of time on Atari. We've got a lot of other things we wanted to ask you about. I got a few more quick ones. You mentioned before modern features that you put in a lot of your game collections. What kind of the standards that are we going to see in this, like save states, rewind feature, etc.?
Yeah, save states and stuff like that. We didn't do rewind from the standpoint that there's too many different emulators, and that's a bit of a bugger thing. And I also, from a development perspective, wanted to spend more on more important things. Rewind for games that, especially that aren't that long, and it kind of takes. It's a little bit cheesy, but if you're playing Asteroids, an arcade version of Asteroids, and you are playing it and you die and you rewind, it kind of loses. You know what I mean? It's inherent.
You've kind of defeated the point of it a little bit.
Yeah, it's not something like overcoming a challenge. It's more about you're kind of going against the fundamental basic design of a game. So we kind of left that, but save, load. We spent a lot of time on making sure each platform has appropriate filters that you can turn off and the bezels, which are normal. We spent a lot of time on if games have analog controls, supporting a lot of options in analog controls that most people don't think about, but people prefer even in a breakout game or something like that, how the analog functions. Do they like it more accurate to the original with momentum and things like that, or not? So there's a lot of options a ton of time that we spend into just things like analog controls. And obviously, the standard scaling stuff you can do, and things like that. So all the basic Digital Eclipse stuff, you can certainly expect there. Also, for this collection, it was really important to be able to access the games library at any time. There's no, in older collections, it's a separate mode, right? The games section is a separate, so you back out of the museum and you go into it. But when you're in the timeline, for example, and at any time you can bring up the games carousel, cool. The games list. So what we wanted you to be able to do is you go through the timeline and say you read about a game that you didn't know. We want you to be quickly and instantly be able to go into that game, play it for a bit, jump back to the timeline instantly, right? It's this sort of interactive kind of content that we really love. And I feel that that's how people, especially people who are new to Atari, are going to want to do that. They're going to go through oh, that's interesting. Let me play for a few minutes. Come back to the timeline. Keep reading. That sort of thing. I'll also give you sort of a nugget that's kind of cool from the timeline perspective. I'm not going to tell you why we did it, but I will tell you that we are doing it. Because the reason is, I'll let you figure out. But we track how much of the timeline you have looked at each timeline. So it's theoretical that, it's obviously possible to do 100%, right? And so now I leave it to you to think, why would they want to track how much of a timeline someone has viewed? So I'll leave you with that little cool nugget.
That's pretty exciting.
So yeah, it's a lot more cohesive, this collection. And like I said, I view it like, you go into a museum and you're in this room. There's all this stuff. There's videos, because we did a bunch of new interview footage. Like, we brought everyone in. So this is all new video footage. They talk about stuff that you won't traditionally hear in sort of collections like this. I think people are going to get a very, are going to appreciate just even the video content that's in this. So between the video content, the models, the art and scans, I mean, I think there's like between like 400 and 500 entries in the timelines or something like that, if I remember right. So there's a lot of content. It's a crazy amount of content.
I'm gonna look at all of it. I'm so excited.
please do, because that's the only way that you're going to get to 100% on your timeline. And why would you want to do that? So yeah, I mean, it's we're really sort of proud of this collection. I'm especially proud of like where it is now in comparison to where it was. Our when we woke up that morning and started thinking about, we never imagined that we could achieve and deliver what this is now, but it's really to a testament to all the people who are very passionate about Atari on the team, and they kind of feed upon each other. There's even additional significant surprises that have come online at the tail end of this project that we never expected to, that haven't been shown or anything like that too. So there's still quite a bit of surprise stuff that people haven't seen, that hopefully they will soon.
Are there any advantages to getting... So, like, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to buy this.
Yeah.
Because I play my Switch more than anything, but this feels like the kind of game I should get for my VCS. Is there any advantage to getting this on the Atari VCS as opposed to on another platform? Did you do any super cool stuff with that joystick controller for paddle-style games?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time doing that. Like, I don't want to talk too much about it because I don't know if they want to talk about it later. But, like, I will just say that we spent a lot of time on analog controls and paddle support and things like that, even to a point where Mike actually spent time building out, for our own sort of use and development, like 3D printed paddle controls that snap over like Xbox controllers and stuff.
Oh, that's cool.
I only say this from the standpoint that, like, attention to detail, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like how many people, like, when they do a collection, would actually, to make sure that they have the feel right of stuff, would they 3D print a whole paddle assembly system to snap onto controllers to make sure that the games feel right? Like, I don't want to toot our own horn, but, like, really, let's be honest, how many people are going to do that?
No, toot away. That's awesome.
That's really cool. And if you want to sell those, I know a company that would be very interested.
Who knows, right? Yeah, who knows? Like, it's like, it's now that he has the plans for and stuff like that. Like, yeah, it'd be cool to be able to have those publicly available in some fashion, right? So we'll see how that goes. It was initially designed as a way for us to be able to test stuff and things like that. Like I said, hopefully people appreciate it. But to your sort of question about the VCS stuff, so, without going into too much detail, we did spend a fair bit on analog controls and things like that. But I will say that, probably the higher end consoles, the consoles that support 4K, not naming any names or anything like that, like, a lot of our assets are huge 4K assets. So I'll just say that, like, example, 4K assets would not make, there'd be no point on a Switch, for example.
Yeah.
Right? So I guess that's one way to sort of think of, if you're interested in, like, zooming in and looking at 4K assets and looking at, documents and things like that, then you probably want to go with a system that supports 4K.
Does the VCS support 4K? I have one and I have no idea.
That's a question. I think so. Yeah, no, I think it does.
I feel like it must. It seems like that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think it does, because I don't think we did any specific changes to it. So I think it does. it's sort of a mini computer anyway, so I imagine that it would do that. But most of the systems in general are pretty much the same. There's no, because these games are like ROM sizes in general or code sizes are pretty small. It's not like you get much SSD bandwidth. You might get it from timelines and videos and things like that, but most of our collections don't really have load times anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But predominantly, it's more of like, we have this has got to be probably the most. I'll have to think about Turtles in this. I'm trying to debate whether this has more 4K. I think this does have more base 4K assets because everything is 4K assets. Even the textures for the box models are 4K. So
that's awesome.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
I just looked it up. The VCS does support 4K HDR.
Yeah, so, I feel bad not knowing that, but I also know that like we didn't really, it wasn't a scenario with like Switch where we we have to sort of manage assets a bit because that's a 1080 on TV and 720 locally. You also have to, I won't bore you with details, but like there's little things like, like vector lines are challenging. You have to spend a lot of time making those work on like, say, the Switch, because at 720p, certain vector, lines can just disappear because there aren't enough pixels, right?
Yeah.
So like, how do you solve that stuff? So I only bring it up from the standpoint that like people look at these collections and they like say, oh, whatever, but like they don't understand how much work goes into things like that. Or like, how do you get the glow of the lines just right? Or how do you have the translucency of bezels, or like in the older games, like if they have like a cellophane or like covering over stuff to get colors, like how do you make that look right? And so there's all this stuff that we spend so late nights just sitting there, like how do you make that accurate? And you can only do that when you have a super passionate team. So I'm so proud of them.
That's fantastic. All right, I got 2 Atari ones left.
Okay.
And I've already forgotten one of them. Rats, where did it go? It doesn't matter. All right, so this is kind of... Oh, that was the other one. Do you know if there's going to be a physical version of this?
I don't think there's been announced. I would say that, in the past, with minor exceptions, every release of ours has a physical release.
Beautiful.
So I'll just say that.
All right. This one's a weird one. I have no idea if you will be able to comment on it, but I figured I'd have to ask. That new Breakout game that's like a Pong Breakout combination thing, it looks super awesome. It also looks vaguely similar to the Choice Provisions Breakout that was planned for the Intellivision Amico. Is there any relation there at all?
That's an interesting question.
Because that Choice Provisions Breakout game looked amazing, and like I was considering an Amico just for that, but of course I don't think that's ever happening now, and I don't know what happened to that game because it looks amazing. So there's my question.
That's a fair question. I'll let you figure that one out.
Okay. That's fair.
But
that's
I will say this though, that if I recall correctly, the footage that's shown in the trailer is more horizontal, and that is a 2-player mode. Okay. And the normal presentation of that game is more vertical.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
That was an outstanding non-answer. That was great. They've all been pretty good so far, but that was really good.
That was very expertly done. Appreciate it. All right, Dan, do you have anything else about Atari before we move on to Ninja Turtles? And also, I mean, how much time do you have left? I don't want to take up your whole day, but...
Oh, no, yeah, go ahead. Like, it's still fine. Yeah, as long as we don't bleed to like 4 o'clock at night, it's okay.
Okay, all right, cool. Do you have any other Atari questions, Dan?
Move on to Turtles.
All right, cool. So, Cowabunga Collection. Holy crap. You would talk about a collection that just kind of blew our collective minds when you guys announced that. How the heck did that come together? And did Konami give you any like hard limits on what you could and couldn't try to do?
So the great thing about Konami, I will say this, as a company, like, regardless of if you have whatever problems with Konami or whatever and things like that, Konami and the people we work with, especially Charles, who's the senior producer over there, and he's the one that's also talking at Comic-Con this week on a lot of the panels and stuff for Turtles. But he's phenomenal. Konami was like, and mainly for his credit, like a lot of companies in general are like, okay, let's put in like 4 games, right, in a collection, or 8 games in the collection, and call it a day, and we'll just find what we can to put in there. And Charles was always like, if we're gonna do a Turtles collection, this is a property that fans really love. You kind of have to go all in. You can't do this piecemeal sort of scenario where we're just going to include a couple games and call it a day. If we're going to do this, let's include as many as we can, within a feasible time, right? Like of development, right?
Right.
And so from the get-go, he's been a huge supporter of like trying to get as much material, as much game stuff. More so than a lot of publishers in the past, he was very like just involved and wants to make things as best as possible. And I had the pleasure of working with on the Yu-Gi-Oh games because our studio is sort of like up until for most of the last number of 5, 6, 7 years has been the key like Yu-Gi-Oh developer for Konami.
Yeah.
Which I've worked on. I've worked on 2 Yu-Gi-Oh games, and I worked with Charles on that. And he put so much heart and soul into the Yu-Gi-Oh games and how he puts together the decks and everything like that. And so I knew going into Turtles and his passion for Turtles that he's going to be awesome on the publisher side because he gets it. He has the same passion that we do as far as like, if we're going to do this, it needs to include everything that we can. And he worked hard to open the floodgates to allow us to do that. So to answer your question, like, no, we tried to do everything. We tried to include as much as we could within reason. And he tried to help us get everything in there that we could. So from the get-go, we knew that this was going to be, a cool project, a little bit daunting, like I said, because it's Turtles and it's well-loved. We need to make sure that we make the right choices about stuff for as best we can, and we need to make sure that it's packed with content, and that's what we did.
Nice.
But I will say that that the whole early on, and kudos to like Charles and Konami. It's like even before development starts, there's such a. We talk about this. I've talked about the rights, like IP holders and things this whole time, but there's a lot of work to get all those cleared. You know what I mean? Konami made those games, but it's Nick now, and it's like Nickelodeon owns the sort of that property, and you got to get. There's multiple groups that are involved in the rights to stuff, and so there even before development starts, they were already Konami as a whole were already working on trying to get the rights to all these games and permissions to include content and art and things like that. So their work began before we even started. So they did a lot of the early legwork. So kudos to Charles and them.
Nice. Was the proximity of this game's release to Shredder's Revenge a coincidence? Like we talked a little bit before the show about this game kind of working around Shredder's Revenge. Was there any connection between these two projects? Did you guys communicate with them about release dates and all that kind of jazz? And why was the release date so hidden for the longest time? Like I have the same question about Shredder's Revenge. It's like, but why didn't you tell us when it was coming out? Why was that the big secret for so long?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was this back and forth because we didn't have. I mean, I can say from the dev team, I don't know how much Konami had, but like insight into Shredder's Revenge and where it was and when it was coming out, because that's a deal that those guys had through Nickelodeon, right? It doesn't have anything really to do with Konami or us. So they have their own schedule and challenges and stuff like that. So they probably had their own fare of issues with getting stuff approved and getting the game working online and yada yada. So it seemed like that date was moving back and forth quite a bit. We tried our best whenever we heard rumblings of the date and stuff like that to do our best to try to stay clear of that as much as possible to avoid predominantly consumer confusion.
Right.
Right? Because, like people just assume, oh, there's a Turtles game. There wouldn't be multiple Turtles games coming out. There has to be just the one. So, and they get confused. So we just did our best to kind of avoid that sort of stuff. So we kept having different release dates, or I'm sure Konami had different release dates planned, and they kept adjusting them for various reasons and things like that. But I think when Shredders finally came out, I assume, and I'm not there at Konami, but I can assume that they're like, okay, that's out now. Let's maybe give it some time, a gap, so that people can enjoy Shredders. We don't take away from any of their hard work and things like that. We give them time in the spotlight, as they so much deserve for that awesome game. And then, hopefully when people are trailing off of Shredder's Revenge and they're looking for their next big, Turtles experience, we come out then.
There you go. Perfect.
Yeah. And there's also a lot of logistics in relation to, as you can imagine, in our COVID world, the challenges of making collector's editions and the many pieces is very difficult, and the timing for all that stuff is very difficult. So I think that probably weighed in on the changing dates and not wanting to confirm anything yet, because you want to get your ducks in a row. I'm sure Konami wants to make sure that all the collector's editions and physical runs and stuff, will come in at the time that is needed before promising a date. So I'm sure that's part of it as well.
Gotcha. So,
was there anything for the Turtles collection that you wanted to put in that you couldn't? Because, I'm looking at the list trying to think of what else could I possibly have wanted in here, and I can't really, apart from maybe, some of the Game Boy Advance games, but, was there anything that kind of, nope, this is off limits, we can't touch this, or anything like that?
No, I mean, I think in hindsight, if I could have, I probably would have fixed and included Manhattan missions.
That was my question. Because that seems to be the only unique. Because it seems like it's just based on everything based on that original cartoon series,
right?
Not anything.
Right.
Because the GBA games you were talking about, they're based on the 20.
Yeah, later. So we wanted to call it. So we knew we weren't going to do GPA because, I think that's moving on to a new generation kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But Manhattan Missions is one that people call out, and it's a thing that we can fix because there's a notorious problem with that, game, as far as being able to finish it or progression, and there's things we probably could have done to improve it a little bit. But we thought about it, but we ended up just saying let's just focus on console and arcade. That's a very clean sort of focus, and kind of throwing one random kind of DOS game in there is probably a little bit weird.
I was hoping for it because it's the only one I've never played. I had only learned about it recently, and I was kind of obviously saying kind of bummed about this collection. That's it's 99.9% of everything I ever could have wanted it to be. So I'm chomping at the bit to get it. But I was kind of a bummer to not see Manhattan Missions on there, just because I'd love to actually give it a try. I didn't even know it was unfinishable. Yeah,
I mean, the thing. I mean, that I will say that I talked to Charles and Konami a lot and about things that we could, additional games that we could add or whatever. And so who knows? I can't promise anything will come out of it. If this game does really well, which I assume it will, who knows if they want to keep the momentum going and release updates to it or whatever, right? That's certainly within the realm of reason. And if we did do that, Manhattan Missions would probably be one of the first things that I would want to include. So
it would be like that, and the only other ones I could think of were all the little handheld LCD games. But I can only imagine the amount of detail and work you guys would put into emulating LCD games with the right level of transparency to give that real look of an LCD thing.
Yeah,
that would be. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. How do you even reconcile something like that being worth the time? Is anyone really going to play it for more than a couple of minutes? But also,
if I were to speak about those games, it would be because people wouldn't expect it.
Yeah,
right. It's they're you go quiet for a little bit, and then you announce download content, and that's something, and people are like, what?
And if you think of all those old games, those people had those. Kids had those everywhere. People have fond memories of those things.
There's 4 of them. There's 4 of them. So it's It's interesting, but to answer your question, like more than a few things have started because someone just says, like, you know what? If we did this, people will be freaked out and they'd be like, "What the heck?" And that's why we do it. That's why we do it to get to like because it shows fan appreciation. Like, wow, these guys get it. They really love these properties. That's the only reason why they would go to this amount of work to release something like that. So.
We mentioned the Manhattan missions. Was there ever a conversation where you talked about possibly porting the many various versions of the first Turtles game? Like, I know there was a Commodore version of that game. Were those ever under? Obviously, you did the split between PC and console / arcade. But
I mean, we definitely thought about that stuff, but it was cleaner. It gets a little bit nebulous. I mean, not nebulous. It gets a little bit messy when you like start to introduce like PC or base stuff and console stuff. It just gets the structure of how things are. It's not horrible, but it's sort of a cleaner thing if you say, okay, let's just stick with consoles and arcade. Like that's very, very sort of a clean kind of experience. It's also the games that most people are familiar with. And that's not to say that we don't like to include obscure things to educate people and stuff like that. But I think in this one, just because there was so much time involvement in getting the rights to all these different things and clearing art and boxes and blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? I think we wanted to kind of lock a list at the beginning and make sure that we got approval for all this stuff and then just proceed from there versus trying to drag in more unknowns or potential issues, given we had a hard dates or relatively hard dates that we were tracking towards that we had to get this thing done in.
So what about Turtles in Time Reshelled? Does that even technically count? Because the artwork has changed so much it doesn't look like the original series cartoons. Like, not even just like, What are your personal feelings on trying to continue? Like, would that even fit? I don't. Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's aesthetically the look of it is too different, right? Like it's. You kind of go for the look of those games is very much like the bright, comic-y, like the cartoon,
2D kind of, and Reshelled is kind of like, I don't know if it's like CG, but it's kind of like this. It's a different. It's like, and mobile game isn't the right response to it, but like it has a very sort of like unique kind of look to it.
Like the in-game characters are very smooth, but not bright. And then all the character art is overly detailed.
Right.
Like Metalhead's got all these like scratches and stuff on them. It's weird. Okay.
So it's just I think aesthetically it's just a little bit too different from the other games, and I think we wanted to focus sort of on that particular if you could say comic book like look, but the illustrated kind of look of classic stuff.
And you got to leave stuff for Cowabunga Collection 2 as well,
right.
Obviously.
Of course.
I mean, you can't put everything in.
That's true.
Was it?
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
No, I got nothing. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, was it a challenge to bring? Because you guys worked on the original. I say the original. I guess it's the original re-release of the arcade game. Back in the day?
Oh, back in the day? On the was it 360?
Yeah. 360 and PS3, I think?
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Are we getting like just a ported version of that, or was this like a bunch like new work was done to it?
Oh yeah, no, this is new. It has nothing to do with that. Though I have to imagine that there's probably a couple people who worked on that or were involved with that who are still here working on this. But no, it's all new stuff.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah.
That's interesting to me, I suppose, in the respect of like, well, we already had a thing that we did, so we could just bring it up. But like, you guys didn't even go that route. You're like, no, all of this is brand new work.
Yeah, exactly. We decided to sort of start fresh, and we're sort of in this. Our process of how we handle different platforms is a certain way in relation to our engine now and things like that. And so we just kind of try to stick with that because it's a known quantity, and then we can spend, instead of trying to port stuff over or bring stuff over from other platforms, we can just spend time adding, quality of life improvements and other things, which is, from my opinion, a better usage of time.
Are there any particular? As I barely slept last night. My dog was just. I was up to it was ridiculous. And I've only had 2 cups of coffee so far today, so that's clearly not enough. Are there any differences between the Western and the Japanese versions of the games? Right, because almost everything's going to have both versions, right? I mean, I suppose except for the ones that don't have Japanese versions.
Right. There's only 2 games that don't have Japanese versions. But I mean, there's little. I mean, obviously, when they did have text, they're in Japanese in some things. There are sort of differences because in some of the stuff, because the Japanese releases oftentimes were the first, and they kind of would fix stuff for the U.S. releases. So I think there's kind of this interesting. If people are interested to kind of see what was the Japan audience exposed to, and how are things working there, even from a flicker, perspective or hardware perspective, how did it look there and how did it get resolved to the US and things like that. There's little differences here and there. Nothing major. Obviously, the turnaround time in most cases between the Japanese release and the US release isn't a very long time. So I think it was more so their time was focused on improving and fixing things versus necessarily changing stuff.
Very cool.
Speaking of stuff like flicker, did you do any sort of a cleanup of things like slowdown or flicker for this release? I know Mega Man's done it a bunch, but that first Turtles game gets pretty flickery. Yeah, if you notice that if you look at any of the footage of the NES games on the trailer stuff, you won't see any flicker.
Or slow down. So we do have those options. Most of these games have options that you can set before you go into the game. So obviously for NES games specifically, you can reduce, slow down, and you can remove, for the most part, the sprite limitations of how many can be drawn on the screen, which reduces the flicker. So you can do it either way. Some people rely on the slowdown to take advantage of it or things like that. So you can still play, as with all of our stuff, you can always play it in its original way. But if you want to improve it, then you can do stuff like that. And most of the games have quite a few options. Even Tournament Fighters, you can, we triggered so you can play as the bosses. You can turn that on if you want. And the NES games have a variety of different options. You can even I don't know what the option's called, but arcade, if you're too good, the game punishes you. You can turn that off. So there's a lot of quality of life improvements that we like to do. The NES games probably have the most that are meaningful, like I said, the reduction in flicker and slowdown and things like that. But there's also other little things here and there that you can turn off and on that are pretty cool. So hopefully people will dig those, and like always, we want people to have flexibility and be able to play these the way they want to.
Well, big thank you for adding the rewind feature to these games, because
yeah, for real.
Dan and I did a charity event a few years back where we tried to beat the NES Ninja Turtles, and we just did horribly. I beat this game when I was a kid. I cannot do it anymore. So
I equate it like most people, kind of like in The Lion King, with the sort of the ostrich race in the trees.
Can't wait to be king level.
Most people don't get past that. Like the water stage in Turtles, one is kind of like the stage where people get to and they kind of give up. A lot of times. So yeah, you can rewind it. Or we have the watch movies in this game, so we recorded playthroughs of every single game. So if you want to, you could watch it all the way until right after the water stage, and then just press the button and start playing from there if you wanted to. So there's two ways you can do it.
Cool. The water stage I have basically memorized. I can do that one kind of no problem. It was like the later levels where we just got hung the heck up.
Right.
But having
well, there you go.
Cleaned up and rewind, that's bless you for that.
Yeah, and not only that, but one of the last things that was a bit of a pain, but we managed to get in there. We all grew up in the era of Nintendo Power and EGM sort of stuff, and we wanted to replicate specifically kind of the Nintendo Power experience. So all the games have a strategy guide that you can bring up, when you're playing the game. That we all custom created with artwork and text bubbles, just like you would imagine in Nintendo Power or other magazines like that, with tips and advice and codes for the games, or like
cool.
tips. And then not only that, but we embed. Like I said before, the watch movies. We take segments of that and we put it in the strategy game. So not only is it just you're kind of looking and reading a tip, but you can press the button and then we'll play the section in the game so you can see how it's done. Or whatever particular tip or something like that will show, footage of the game of the tip. So it's kind of like this interactive strategy guide.
That's nice.
So that's a new thing for with every collection we try to add new features and cool new things and kind of build and don't rest on our laurels, and that was one of the cool additions that I think hopefully people will appreciate. It's kind of a fun nod, and it has the classic kind of word balloons with funny how the characters speak and things like that. So hopefully people will get a kick out of them, and actually it should hopefully help you to remember some of like the secrets and strategies that you might have forgotten over the years.
See, that's the kind of thing I was hoping to hear you say for the Atari collection, was like interactive hint systems and things like that for what you should be doing. I can't wait to see that in motion. I'm pretty excited about it.
Yeah.
I have never been able to find what this person was talking about. I was just on some sort of comment thread at some point, and someone was like, "I'm not buying the Cowabunga Collection. It's going to be heavily altered and missing a bunch of content." I'm like, what? I have never been able to find anything about that. Is there anything removed? I mean, is like the Pizza Hut logo still in the background in stages or anything like that? Or
there are some things that had to be changed. Unfortunately, not much. Like little things here and there. Pizza Hut is one of them, unfortunately. But our mantra, like in general, is to keep things exactly the same as much as possible. And the only reason we would change something is because it's a direct request from the publisher, or if it's like a legal issue, right? Or things like that. Like I was bringing up in a tweet recently because I was looking at going through Street Fighter, and we changed through Capcom's request. We changed aspects of that game, such as the the Air Force logo in Gala stage, right? If you will notice that past our Street Fighter collection and any version of Street Fighter ever since that utilizes our the logo that we put in there, and so it's just a sort of a situation of the times that we're in and things like that, and all I can say is that we fight to include everything possible that we can that's original, and try to keep the original intent of the people who originally worked on it and things like that. And sometimes though things have to be changed. When we do change it, it's not a lot if we have to. In this game, it's very minimal, if any, very little that's changed. Most of the games have nothing changed them at all. And it's not changing per se. It's maybe like removing or things like that.
Like major content or like a level missing.
It's kind of like the
like
same
that.
thing. Like in the Blizzard Arcade Collection, you can't have the Red Cross logo in anything nowadays. And the Red Cross logo, if you are aware, in the era of 16-bit and 8-bit, they used it a lot for health packs.
That was health and like everything, yeah.
everything. You can't include that anymore. So that's a classic case of we have to go in, and in every instance of that something that looks like the red cross, you have to remove it.
Oh my god, is that why it's green in Doom now?
Yeah, that's probably why.
I never thought about that before, but I'm thinking about like, no, I was just playing Doom recently, and there's crosses on. Wait a second, aren't they green now? Oh, wow, you just blew my mind.
That's why. So that's why it gives that example where it's just like, it's a different time. You have to remove this stuff, or you can get into serious issues for whatever reason. And you try not to, but some cases you just have to. But from a company perspective, from a developer perspective, we try to avoid that as much as possible, and we fight against every change that we have to do for sure.
Awesome. All right, here's something I just need some general life clarity on. What's the deal with the Ninja Turtles theme song? Like, is there some weird rights issue with the Turtles theme song from the cartoon?
Yeah, I mean, I leave it up to Konami to respond to that because they're the ones sort of dealing with it. But I can say that the reason why there's so many issues with it in general is because it's, in general, again, a little bit nebulous of who owns the full rights, and no one owns the full rights to it, from my understanding. So you have to get permissions of multiple people, and it's not clear-cut who has the most amount of ownership and things like that. So as you can imagine through, the various releases in the past, even the arcade 1-up stuff and things like that, there's definitely some issues with that music. And, I'll let whatever the outcome is, I'll let, Konami sort of officially comment on that. But I can say that it is a very difficult situation.
Really?
So
I mean, I guess it's so I guess is it just for the original recording of it, or is it the tune itself?
No, I think I don't want to put words on the mouth, but I think it has to do with specifically the original recording, the people who are on it, the potentially the company who recorded it, the people who own it now. You know what I mean? It's like it's a lot of like different ones, and all it takes is one person to say no. And again, it's from my understanding, it's with a lot of the other stuff. It's because so much time has passed. It's a little bit unclear of who really has control over it, right? And how much control they have over it. Like they may say, like, we own this, but we can only use it in these certain situations with the permission of A, or whatever. So I just know it's a complex issue.
The city stage in the Turtles arcade game that constantly references that melody, that should be fine. But the title screen might not have the original.
Yeah,
TV
I mean, I
theme
think
on it.
That's totally a good example of something that might happen and things like that. Like I said, I leave it to Konami to officially respond to that how they want to. I just know, in every collection we do, there's always points of contention as far as who owns the rights and stuff. There's always question of who owners, and I brought some of that up with Atari even. And it gets worse and worse the longer it goes, because so much time has passed, and no one who was directly involved with it is even around anymore. So
yeah, that's wild.
I think about that Sonic collection that just came out, and all the music that they had to change up from the Genesis version because of all the music rights issues, and it's a huge bummer because the music is such a big part of what made the classic game so special. I mean, especially like as being a little kid, you go into the arcade and you're hearing a video game playing the music that your TV show is supposed to play, and it's like, what? So
what is that?
Yeah, and I can't speak from experience too. Just working at different publishers, including Sega and Activision, yada yada. That early days, 8-bit, 16-bit era especially, oftentimes developers or publishers never really thought that they would ever do sequels or follow-ups or anything. So in order to save money, they would say, okay, you're doing the music, we just have the rights to use it in this game. This one game, this one release, right? Because, you're always trying to save money. So you're not thinking, especially then, no one's thinking that they're going to make a bunch of sequels or follow-ups, that they're going to use the song or anything. So they're like, we'll move on to something else. So how do we save money now? They're like, well, if you're just using this song, it's only this cost, right? And like, okay, let's take it. So I give that as an example of where back then, oftentimes people didn't think forward enough as far as like potentially reusing stuff, artwork, music, whatever. And they just said, we're only going to be using it for this game. That's it. And that's what we paid for. So.
Yeah, you see that with like the old Doctor Who episodes. Like I know that's a big thing with them of trying to like complete that series. It's next to impossible because they were like,
right.
Yeah, all right, we're done with this. We're just going to record over the tapes. Like it was your mom recording her soap operas. Like, we're done. Yeah. It's all good.
Yeah, we deal with that all the time. The amount of lost stuff that, in projects that we've worked on in the past that were just lost because people recorded over stuff where they didn't think it was needed anymore because, after 20 years, who cares?
Right.
So that's something we struggle with all the time as we try to dig for stuff. And, thank goodness for people in this part of preservation too. Thank goodness for people who happen to have it, on their hard drives or they left the company and they have it, like Samurai Showdown Perfect, only exists, that version only exists. And we were able to bring it out to the world and finish it is because someone had it on a hard drive who no longer worked for the company. Otherwise, to this day, no one would ever be able to play that game. So save the stuff, everybody. Save your stuff.
Don't delete things. Was there any thought to including the European version of the original song, the Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles?
There's always thoughts about sort of stuff and things like that, and there's always versions of different songs, and we even thought about like, what if we allow people to select between the music tracks, and it just became a little messy with like trying to get rights. And again, it really, and I hate repeating this, but man, it is so complicated. So many years have gone by, and just to say like adamantly like this song, who owns it? And you're like, I do, and then you're like, wait a minute, I don't think you do. I think they do. And they're like, we do? And then, like, I'm serious. Like, people, like, and it's not just, and we're talking about using it, but I'm just saying in general about any, like, a piece of artwork on the cover of a game. Obviously, the publisher owns that. They're like, I don't think we own this. And like, well, who owns it? And you track down the original person who drew it. They're like, oh no, I sold this to X. And you're like, what? And then you're like, you find them out and they're like, I'm not really interested in like, being involved in it. And you're like, So it's so much, I can't undersell how much investigation work goes into these collections and just clearing it. And especially if a publisher has changed around a lot or the people are all new and they don't have insight into how things happened in the past, things disappear or you just don't know how they, where they've gone. And that's why, at least with Cowabunga Collection, thank goodness Konami kept so much of this stuff, the design documents, artwork and things like that. There's so much in this collection. And just design documents. It's funny because, I was tweeting Chris Kohler, who's the editorial director and writes a lot of the stuff and helps to find a lot of the stuff. He had to deal with IGN, or we had to deal with IGN, where they shared a little bit, like 12 of like pieces of concept art, right? Mm-hmm. And he goes, this is just a little bit that's in the collection. I said, well, to be clear, it's a little, tiny bit of the collection, right? Because the amount of content in this collection is similar to Atari, but like of Turtles behind the scenes content in this collection is staggering. Like it is immense. Like whatever you think in any collection in the past, you think, that's a lot of content. That's not even remotely close to how much content is in this. Just the design documents alone are like an immense amount of documentation. And most of this has never been seen. People, the casual gamers will come into this collection. They'll be like, I play the games. I love this. But really, and we've only shown little glimpses of it, like in the new trailer with the you see a glimpse of the Turtles layer, right? Which is the Turtles layer. It's kind of the interface to the museum of all the content. It is an immense amount of content. So
you're out here making like old games my game of the year this year.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And not only
dive
that,
so much into that stuff.
but not only that, and I assume this occasion, but like the design there's so much design documents, and we actually went through and localized it all too. It's not even just in native Japanese. Like we went through, and I don't know how much time Kris and I spent, but putting boxes next to each individual Japanese phrase and putting what the translation is in all of the languages that is supported. So,
oh my goodness,
you think about like, let's say one design doc sheet could have like 30 sections of text. That's one. That has to be translated across numerous languages, and that we have to put in there. Now imagine that, in the many hundreds. Again, I share that because it's, I almost got like carpal tunnel, like, moving that stuff around, positioning it around and things like that. Because I had to do it for most of the languages and make sure that they were aligned right with the Japanese text and things like that. And it's I don't know how many thousands upon thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of lines of text there are in there. And that's just the design document. And I say that there's a ton of design document. That is one thing. There's many others.
That's crazy.
So hopefully I'm not underselling what is in there, but I think because it hasn't been a focus of the trailers and things like that, people are going to assume that it's like, have the standard galleries and some behind the scenes art and things like that. We had to build the turtle lair because there was so much content, and so you navigate around, you kind of move around the turtles lair, and you go to different sections that are focused on different things. So I hope people are going to be kind of blown away by how much is there.
I am very much looking forward to being blown away by it.
Yeah, and I think it's really important, because you mentioned it earlier, and I've seen, reading some interviews with some of the other people that work for, Digital Eclipse and whatnot, of really trying to focus on being the Criterion Collection.
Yes.
Right, and that's a weighty statement, right? Like, the Criterion Collection, that has some oomph behind that.
Yes.
And it's... I think it's really interesting that we're in a point now where games have been out long enough and we can appreciate them as an art form and look at their growth, and much in the same way that we look at the history of cinema, going back and watching the old original films and kind of seeing the growth of how do we get to Endgame from Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, right? But there's a through line in all those movies to get from A to B.
Yeah.
Is there? So I guess that naturally leads into the question, right? You've got the Atari collection coming out later this year, right?
Yeah.
Cowabunga Collection is in a scant few weeks that we will have that. Can you let us know what you're looking at next? Is there anything bubbling under the surface? Because
there's a lot.
We have suggestions if you're looking for things.
We always love suggestions. This is a very busy year for us. These two collections are big, and we have, as far as number of stuff we're working on for the latter half of this year is even more. So this and going into 2023 is a very big year for us development wise with the number of releases. It's busy. It's frighteningly busy a bit. But these two will be coming out. These will be the first two, and I expect that shortly thereafter, these things come out, you'll start to hear rumblings about some of the next stuff. But we're working on several different things for sure.
So there will be some announcements soon, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I don't know when, because obviously it depends on the relationships with the publishers and things like that. But I think we're just focused right now. Cowabunga and Atari 50 are already huge things in their own, and like, let's give them time to breathe and get the information out there, and then let's start to think about announcements of some of the other stuff. We're always working on multiple things. We're growing because these collections are getting bigger and bigger. I mean, you compare like Cowabunga or Atari 50 to like even Mega Man Legacy Collection, which is an awesome collection its own, but like in scope is, comparison to now, that was like 400 megabytes, I think 450 megabytes in size. Now we're in the, 10 to 20 gig, range of stuff. Like it's crazy. It's crazy. So, and it's just because, the teams are so passionate. And going back to your movie thing and the Criterion stuff, is like, we definitely strive for that, because it's the unfortunate aspect where, like, whenever a new platform comes out for movies, you get the re-release of Casablanca and and all the classic films that were released back in the day. You get them over and over again. You don't get that in games. You might get remasters and stuff, and there's examples of like games being released on multiple platforms, but generally it's one and done. You don't see it again, which is unfortunate, because there's so much out there that is a significant historic relevance to games and influence where games are going and where they came from. But also, there's entire audiences who just never had an opportunity to see this stuff and know what it's about. So that's part of our, our pillars, is like, let's bring these games, which are amazing, and these experiences, which are, had an impact, deep impact on this industry. And let's bring it to new audiences and educate people. I was so happy in this statement that, when I was talking to Atari, and they obviously are happy with where Atari 50 is going, but the greatest thing for me was that they kind of said in a discussion that, like, I think any new employee who comes to Atari, we need to have them play this collection. And it's because
does the praise get higher than that?
Yeah.
It's because it does such an amazing job of going through the 50 years of Atari through these timelines and calling out. You obviously can't call it everything, but we try to call it everything that we can that is of substantial importance, and bringing in all of the people to record new interviews and sequences, and even getting people like Ed Freeze and Cliffy B to give their insights on the impact of what Atari had on them is great to have in a nice kind of outside perspective, and and even like bringing in author Ready Player One, the books, who we're good friends with, and I don't know if sort of people know this, but during the Ready Player One, there was a 2600 game called Stacks that was created, and it's sort of a homebrew. It was actually a homebrew created by or revised by as well Mike and Kevin, who work at our company, and is sort of a kind of a celebration of the author Ready Player One, his kind of desire and his growing up and loving the Atari stuff and wanting to have an Atari game, which is reflected in the book and things like that. And so we, ended up creating that physical game. And, that's sort of one of the quote unquote homebrews that are also included in the Atari collection. So, we're trying to touch all facets of, this, not just getting the insights from the people who worked at Atari, but, key people who were fans of Atari and watched it kind of grow into what it is today, and what their insights are and their memories of like playing Adventure for the first time or whatever. So that's why I kind of call out the historical context, and I think that's where a lot of these collections fail is that they feel that, they copy regardless of, like what we did in the past, which is kind of like, oh, the games and some behind the scenes content. But that's not all that there is now. It's the historical relevance and educating people about the importance of these games. And that's sort of what we really focus on now. And I think getting all these perspectives and doing all these videos and talking to the actual original development teams help that and provide context. So hopefully people will enjoy those.
I can't tell you how much I personally appreciate it, because I absolutely love I love the work you guys have done, and everything you're talking about with historical context is, I mean, it's there's a reason I've spent a ridiculous amount of hours watching Jeremy Parish's Video Works series on YouTube, because it's just the historical context surrounding everything is half of what makes these classic games so fascinating to me. Even though I grew up with most of it, just learning, there's so much more to learn about it, like especially with Atari. I cannot wait to dive into all the stuff you're doing with that.
Yeah, and I think, selfishly, I would like to believe that people who are remotely Atari fans will buy the collection, but really who, what I measure success with is the people who are non-traditional fans of it. Like, SNK 40th was a success because, let's be quite honest, like the audience of people who are specifically just fans of pre-Neo Geo SNK arcade games is not huge, but because we put so much historical context about it and like why those games are important and how they impacted the industry and the arcade industry and things like that, we had so many people buying and sending a message and commenting on that. Like, well, it's like, I never played these games. I don't know what they are. But, your presentation and how you explained their importance was very entertaining and great. And that's sort of why I bought it, and now will buy all future D stuff. And that's where I consider the win. Like I kind of take it for granted. Like I'm hoping that, the Atari age members and Atari fans are like going to buy this collection because it's Atari. But really, I want the people to reach out. It's like, you know what? I didn't grow up in the Atari age, or I only, came in the tail end of it. But I bought this because, the presentation looked really cool and it seemed interesting. But that's the victory for me. That it transcends just the base audience that it's sort of designed for, and it's kind of become bigger than just sort of quote unquote collections. It becomes sort of this entertaining, sort of educational kind of thing, that kind of grows and expands beyond there. And that's where I feel really happy about the work that we do.
Yeah, I think you definitely hitting on that. Like, I know just from personal experience, I have two 13-year-old daughters, and showing them like the trailers for the Cowabunga Collection, because we sat down as a family and like played through Shredder's Revenge, and it was like, oh, this is so cool. And it was like, well, let me show you what else is coming out. And what's really interesting for them, and again, kind of like comparing it back to the way films were, is that like when we were kids growing up, like in the 80s, 90s, whatever, films that came out in the 40s looked relatively similar to films that we were growing up on, right? The special effects were a little bit better.
Right.
But if you weren't watching a special effects film, it didn't really matter. Acting is acting. And when we were kids, it was always, what's the next big thing? Like, oh my God, look at the graphics. The jump from 8-bit to 16-bit was, oh, this is mind-blowing. Whereas our kids now, like the generation of kids that are early teenagers and a little bit younger, Kris's kids are a little bit younger than mine, they've grown up with everything. So they don't look at something and be like, well, I'm not going to go back and play that because it looks old. Whereas I know a lot of us in the 80s and 90s were like, well, I'm not going back and playing that. That looks terrible. I'm going to play what's the new hotness, versus appreciating this and showing this kind of stuff to like my kids. They were, oh my God, I can't wait to play through the arcade game. That looks amazing. That looks so fun. They're not judging it based on what it looks like only. They're judging it based on that historical context. And isn't this cool that it looks different? And they have an appreciation that we didn't necessarily have. And I find that really, really interesting. And I'm hopeful that kind of thing continues. Because, like, you're right. Every time, I mean, we get Grand Theft Auto for every system that gets released.
Yeah.
But we don't get, that's such a perfect comparison of like Casablanca has been released. You had it on VHS, you had it on Betamax, you had it on DVD, HD DVD, Blu-ray, 4K Blu-ray, whatever is streaming the next thing. Yeah. And so much of that is lost to video games. So hopefully with these sorts of collections and, whatever you're going to announce in the future, that sort of stuff continues to build on that legacy. And we start to appreciate these things a little bit more than perhaps we did. And maybe we can start preserving more of it. I can't even imagine how much has been lost.
Oh, yeah.
Already.
I mean, every day it's lost. And that's why, we consider the little wins as far as discovering, games that someone had on their hard drive or, brought home on floppies or whatever. It's always, we never take that for granted because those are the major victories that we kind of do. But it's interesting, you mentioned your kids and stuff that I kind of funny as a side note. There's so many games in this collection, and you even think about like the 2600 and how many game variations, some of them have like 44 game variations and things like that, which is crazy. So some of the team members brought in their kids and had them doing bug reports and things like that, and it was obviously initially it's kind of like the kids are like, really, I gotta do this, but you could see as they played more and more and more that they came to appreciate these sort of games and the simple nature of them, and you could see that transition as they continued to play. And I think now they have a much stronger appreciation for that era of games. What makes those games so great due to their simplicity and the need to fill in with imagination. So it was a fun sort of a journey to kind of see these kids where they started and where they are now. And I was told by one of the engineers that their kid, they're like, oh, you don't have to come in tomorrow. And the kid was like, well, no, I can come in tomorrow and help, and play it. Especially the what we call the reimagined games, because, a lot of those look a little bit more modern, even though they're homages to some of the other stuff like, haunted houses and stuff like that. And they're big games in their own right. And that's a nice juxtaposition because you have some of these games that are designed to be played in 15, 20 minutes, whatever, 30 minutes. And then we also have some of these games such as haunted houses that, have multiple houses now. And it's like a game in its own right. And Quadra Tank, where it's like so many levels and modes for, 4 players and things like that. And we don't talk about those extra additions as well. But, there's a lot of playability and time in that stuff. So even if you're only playing for a little bit, it's the 2600 or 5200 or whatever, and you spend a little time in the Jaguar stuff, we also have these new games that are going to take you a bit longer to finish, right? I feel it's a nice variety because you have Vector Sector, which is sort of an homage to the vector-based games. You have Haunted Houses, you have Quadra Tank, you got Air World, you have sort of the breakout new updated experience that that's being made and things like that. And so I think and even like, Breakout has like a lot of levels. Like that's the normally that would just be released as like a standalone game almost, you know what I mean? So having that all together with other stuff that we haven't even shown yet, I think, presents like a very sort of hopefully compelling package that will help, satisfy like everybody or as many people as we can out there who pick it up.
Awesome. Kris, did we lose you?
Uh-oh.
Oh, maybe. Man. Well, I mean, we don't want me to be responsible for ending things. All right. Yeah, give me 1 second. Let me see if I can get
Okay.
Let me just shoot Kris a message real quick. He says he's still here. Hold on.
Oh yeah, I don't hear him.
Okay. He can hear us. Right.
I can hear you.
Okay. All right, hold on. Let me see if he needs to. He might need to reboot something. Oh well. Ooh, maybe.
Hello.
There you go.
That's my microphone. Back. There we go. My mic.
Yeah, see, Kris, you have to unmute yourself. That's how podcasts work.
No, I wasn't muted. It came unplugged. How did my microphone come unplugged? That's weird.
We just missed his entire. He had a really exciting kind of speech that he's been saying for the last 5 minutes, and we just imagine, if you will, in your head, a super compelling speech.
All right. Well, I was saying. I mean, I had a question. You were mentioning the newer games, and was it Yar's Revenge Reimagined? Is that what it's called?
I think the official name in the game is like maybe Yar's Revenge Enhanced. I think that's what it's called.
Because there's they're all Recharged coming out.
Yeah,
that's
which
totally
are sort of
though.
Yeah, they're sort of different. Like they kind of did their own thing. Our Yars, which Mike did, is it runs fundamentally on the original game. So you can play the original game, but at any time you can hit the shoulder button and it puts the new layer of paint on it. So the AI and just the code that's running underneath is the original game. Mike has just gone in and made it look more modern,
cool.
Most part, and fix some things here and there. But you can switch between the two versions anytime you want to.
Oh, spiffy. Well, I think I'm about out of questions for those two games in particular. I got a couple of just random ones. If you've got a few more minutes.
Sure. Yeah, that should be fun.
Yeah. Now we're going into the next hour on Death Junior. Were you at the company that time?
No, I was at Sega during Death Junior. Ironically, when I was working at Sega, my first project was working with some of the team members that are here now, eons ago, because my first project at Sega was the Sega Genesis Collection.
Oh wow!
And and so just through virtue, like I worked with Digital Eclipse, their backbone, that era of stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's weird. I eventually ended up here, but that was my first project at Sega.
That's wild.
So with the Disney Classic Games Collection, I was very confused by that game's release. Like, what happened where there was just a second version that added the other Aladdin game and Jungle Book? What was the story there?
We released it. I worked on that first one. I didn't work on the expansion. That was another producer, but I worked on the first one, and it just did really well. I think during the time we just got barraged, or maybe Disney did, or Nighthawk got barraged with like, can you include Capcom's Aladdin game? That's the one thing that's sort of missing.
That's what I wanted. That was the reason I didn't buy it on day one.
A lot. The amount of emails and stuff about that was staggering. Of people wanting it, and it's just like wasn't feasible at the time. And then we thought, well, could we make a deal with Capcom to maybe sell this as DLC or something? And then I was like, I think we talked about it, and I was like, just the one game by itself is not really a great DLC. I mean, that's just one thing. Like, if that's the case, you just give it away free or something. I think you have to have sort of a bit more meat on your bones if you're going to sell DLC. So they kind of went away for a little bit, and then it was obviously during the COVID times too, so things were always slower, and everyone was going through restructuring, and so discussions kind of stalled a little bit. But when they did come back, they were like, well, what are some other games that we could add that might make it worth it to do DLC? And so, went through a bit, and what are ones that Disney can relatively get rights to and are okay with, and things like that. And so the Jungle Book games came up because, again, of the connection with the Virgin team, the original Aladdin team. Mm-hmm. Some of them had worked on that, and it was actually, if I remember right, started before Aladdin and then finished after Aladdin, because they kind of went off and did Aladdin, and they came back and finished Jungle Book or something like that. So it fell in place in the story as far as like the same team or team members, and it was a logical progression from Aladdin, so it made sense to include those. So that's when we came to realize, okay, maybe if we include the Jungle Book games and we include the Capcom version of Aladdin, that's a meaty enough DLC, and we include the artwork and all the other stuff that you'd expect, the music, yada yada. And so that was great. And that was sort of greenlit, like, okay, let's do that, and we can sort of sell it. I think at that time they weren't pressing any more of the original game, or it sold really well, and they weren't doing any more or something like that. And they're like, well, maybe people missed that. Should we release a new version of it that would include the new content as well, for people who want it, or physical collectors who want another physical release, or whatever the reason. So it made sense enough that there was enough content that it's like, well, if you have the old release, you can just buy the DLC. If you want the new version of the game with the new packaging and all the other stuff, you can buy that too. So that's kind of how it kind of came to fruition.
All right.
But the spark of that, the initial spark of that, was just the amount of feedback that we got about Capcom Aladdin, and then just thinking like, well, just releasing that by itself doesn't make sense.
Gotcha. That makes sense. It makes sense that it doesn't make sense.
Right, exactly.
Let's see. I don't think you guys have any direct control over it, but I'm sure you've gotten plenty of questions. Do you have any insight on why the Disney Afternoon Collection isn't on Switch?
So I think it's sort of the case where, at the time the Switch wasn't there. Like, the Switch kind of came in late, and I think I'll say this across the industry in general. I not necessarily just Capcom, but I think people were very unsure of if the Switch was going to go anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so even when it had been out for a little bit, there weren't any immediate plans to support it. And I think there was a lot of wait and see attitude towards that. But as it started to quickly accelerate in popularity and stuff like that, I think there was a scramble across the industry of like, oh man, we really got to start, working on the Switch stuff. And that came during Street Fighter, because even Street Fighter, which was started later than Disney Afternoon Collection, or maybe there was a little bit of overlap at the tail end of Disney Afternoon Collection, it wasn't until later that the Switch version was decided upon that we were going to do it. It was never planned for initially. But fortunately it did, because it allowed us to include like a tournament mode, which couldn't have easily been done on the other platforms. But it was kind of like everyone's forward thinking. So I think they didn't really think about the Switch version for Disney Afternoon Collection, especially in the context that, like, well, it's a new platform, so now everyone has to go through and get the rights and permissions for everything again. You know what I mean? If that makes sense. Because it had already been released. This would have come out later. Is it worth it to just release the game by itself? And also, is it worth it again to potentially pursue all the rights? I'm kind of guessing on some of this stuff. Like, I don't know exactly this case, but it makes sense. Like, that this makes sense. So I potentially think that there was just the time investment to get the rights cinched up and the deal worked out with all the different parties, and the timing of it. And Capcom was busy at that time. It was coming. Street Fighter was coming out, and there's a lot of other projects that they were working on, and it kind of slipped through, I think. And we had a little bit more hope when we came back and kind of did the Mega Man Legacy Collection on Switch, and we were able to add in a little bit more functionality to it and things like that. But I think that was because Capcom had plans for Legacy Collection 2, right? And more Mega. So I think that's the only reason that came into existence. It probably would have been weird if they released Mega Man Legacy Collection 2 on Switch and there wasn't an original one, right?
You can't play the first 6 Mega Man games. You can play
exactly.
7,
So that
8,
was
9,
really
10.
weird.
Yeah.
So I think that's why that sort of happened. And I think that's also why there was no reason to go back for Disney Afternoon Collection. But I will say, for fans of that collection, like, we continue to pursue that and talk to people about that. Especially now that we have more of a connected relationship with the inclusion of Capcom's Aladdin. in the updated Disney collection, and we have that relationship now. And Disney has been talking with Capcom, and we have, and things like that. So I think that potentially in the future there could be something that comes out of it. I don't know. If I was a betting person, I don't think that it would be released in its original version. You know what I mean? At this point, because it would be weird to just release it by itself only on Switch. But if we ever end up doing another Disney collection in the future, which I have to think that we will, there's nothing set right now, but because of the success of these two that have been released, they've done really, really well. I can only imagine that Disney and folks would want to continue that and keep doing more. That's just my hypothesis. And if that's the case, then maybe those games would become part of a greater collection of sorts. That's my hope. But I don't think, and it wouldn't make really sense to just release a Switch version of that game on its own by itself right now. I don't think. It would just be weird. Because,
I'd buy it.
No, I know you'd buy it, but it's just like, like to market it and to get it out there and things like that. They're going to want it to do well.
Yeah.
And then the other platforms, people will be like, if they didn't buy it before, not that they can't buy it now, but like they're like, oh, it came out on Switch. What about the version? Because we'd have to update it. We'd add more stuff inevitably, right? It's like, well, what about the other versions and things like that? So
what
it's
about
a bit
Gargoyles?
messy.
That was part of the Disney afternoon. There's Gargoyles games.
Gargoyles,
Get them on
exactly.
there.
Gargoyles, things like that. So we'd want to do something.
And that's only been on Genesis.
So my thing that I would wish is that we do another version, not Disney afternoon, but a new Disney collection, and with other stuff. And as part of that, we would include those games as well. That would be my dream scenario. And then everyone wins. The Switch finally gets those games. Everyone else gets, new games and enhancements and things like that. And hopefully everyone is happy.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's one of those situations that I look at and get frustrated. Like, these were all Nintendo games. It's a collection of Nintendo games, and the Nintendo system's the only place they aren't playable. I get it. What you're saying makes sense. It drives me bananas, but I'm already.
It drives a lot of people.
So.
That's one of the ones. Just like the Capcom Aladdin, we get hit all the time with, can you please release Disney Afternoon Collection on Switch? And I'm like, I would if we could. All it takes is Capcom to call us up and say, like, hey, do you want to do this? And we're like, yeah, we'll do it. And we'll have it done relatively fast. But they haven't called us yet.
Rats.
You want me to call
sticking
them?
with Capcom, the Street Fighter collection that you guys put together is phenomenal. The one thing that I was wondering, and I saw a lot of people asking this as well, was that it seemed to be specifically just the arcade versions, whereas especially when you get to stuff like Alpha 3, the home console versions had a lot more to offer.
Sure, the World Tour mode and like even the PSP with Upper and things like that. Yeah.
Oh my god, yeah, Alpha 3 on PSP, being able to play it on TV without some weird PSP setup, that would be amazing. Is there, and a lot of people grew up with Street Fighter on console as opposed to the arcade one, like the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions. Is there any thought to doing some sort of Street Fighter console collection or something like that? Is that something that may be in the future?
I would, I'd love to do that. But I think that Capcom as a whole, predominantly now that it's focused in Japan, really Capcom is driven by Japan at this point, quite honestly. I think they're more focused on the future of the Street Fighter franchise, like with 6 and things like that, and less about the past. You've got Arcade 1-Up releasing, obviously, the legacy games and things like that, but I think that, you have some stuff like in the fighting game release recently, right? The fighting collection.
Yeah.
That has, Ultra, not Ultra. Is it Ultra Street Fighter 2? I was confused. The Switch one is Ultra Street Fighter 2. Hyper Street Fighter 2. Like the naming. Ultra Street Fighter 2 is on the Switch. Hyper Street Fighter 2 is, a game. They included that, right? And that's sort of like the equivalent of the Street Fighter party game, really.
That's the one where you can play as like World Warrior Guile against Super Ryu or something. Yeah, okay.
I really wanted to include the arcade version of that in the collection, the original collection, but people felt that it was not a balanced game.
good.
I'm like, that doesn't really matter. It's a party game.
It's
so in hindsight, it's a hindsight. So unfortunately, like my regrets for that, while we're talking about Street Fighter, my regrets for that is not being able to include the movie arcade game, which most people have not played. They've only played the home version. They've only played the home version, right?
Yeah.
So I want to include that, but obviously movie rights, it wasn't enough time to get likeness rights, all the movie stuff. So next time if I do a Street Fighter collection, if I do the next celebration, I work on it, I would start the process for that right off the bat to try to get the arcade movie right. So there's that. Hyper Street Fighter 2 I wanted to include because it is a fun party game. It's just like, it's not balanced, but it's just fun people can choose different versions of it. So they ended up including that in this game because we didn't include it. But I don't think for the most part that they're too interested in the older Street Fighter games anymore. Quite honestly, even though they do well, like, Street Fighter Collection to this day still sells over 100,000 units every 3 months, and it's like 4 years.
That's crazy.
4 years old, literally by clockwork. It sells over 100,000 units every 3 months. It keeps going up the Capcom Platinum list. It used to be at 100, now it's at like 40 something. And it'll keep going up. Like the next, I bet in when they announce the numbers for that at the end of this month, it will surpass Resident Evil 4. So it keeps selling. It's evergreen. So I guess maybe since that exists and it continues to sell, I don't know who's buying it. Thank you for buying it. The 100,000 plus or 200,000 plus every 3 months who buy it. Thank you so much. I don't know who you are at this point. But I think they see that it continues to sell, and you can kind of see that because in Japan they bundled the 30th anniversary collection with the new fighting collection as a 2-pack. So I think they view that as like, this is older Street Fighter, and they'll keep selling it because it keeps being, people buy it. So weirdly enough, maybe once Street Fighter 30th like completely disappears and sells nothing, then maybe they would consider a new collection. I'm guessing. Would I love to work on it? Of course. Like, there's so many things that I feel that we could add and fix, and there's many, decisions that I would change and things like that. That was my first project here at Digital Eclipse. I was brought in to work on, because I'm a big fighting game fan. Keep wanting to work on a Mortal Kombat collection too, which always comes back around but then disappears every year or so. It's very funny. I always have some great ideas for Mortal Kombat collection. They're in a PowerPoint presentation. It's great. I'm very excited to ever work on a Mortal Kombat collection. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It was just for the collection, it was the focus was just on arcade games because those were the definitive kind of games throughout history, and we wanted to stick with that for consistency, even to the point that there are very specific board revisions that Capcom wanted to utilize for it and things like that. So it was always an arcade thing. They felt that was the cleanest way to do it and for consistency. And so we just focused on that. That was very much the goal from the beginning. There was no ever any plans to include any home versions of that stuff. There were plans. I tried to get Rainbow and Accelerator editions in there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I tried really hard. I mean, how would you even go about doing that? Like, who even owns that? Like, they don't. It's a Chinese bootleg. It's not. You can't, like, Capcom should not be afraid of a Chinese company who is bootlegging their game. You know what I mean? Like, that would just be ridiculous. So it did make a lot of progress. And I feel that those games are an important part of Street Fighter history because of where they were with the slowness, of Super, and where they went with Super Turbo, and how inspired Hyper. It was all a speed thing, right? Mm-hmm. And there's no doubt that Rainbow and Accelerator Edition, depending on where you were in the world, which version you played, it had an impact on arcade sales, profit, and on the speed and it was a fun thing. It was unbalanced, but it was just crazy fun. It was a party game.
Yeah.
So there's no doubt it had an impact on Street Fighter in general. And because of that historic context, I wanted to include it. And we almost did. It got kiboshed at the tail end. I don't know by who or what. But it was very, very close to being included in the collection.
Oh,
I had
that
it running
would've
in
been
I had it running in the
amazing.
collection and played it in the collection. It was in the collection for a little bit. But we had to unfortunately remove it. That was if I had a dream, I would include those, the movie arcade game and Hyper Street Fighter 2. That would have been my dream release of that collection.
Wow. We had, I think it was Rainbow at our local ShopRite here in New Jersey.
Right.
I remember going, my mom would go to checkout and I'd go into this little area, the little cove where they had like 2 arcade machines. And I saw like Ryu floating in midair, throwing 2 fireballs at a time and being like, what is this? And like for the longest time, I thought I imagined it. I just thought it wasn't real. And then the advent of the internet comes around and people talk about this. Oh my God, that's what it is. I played that thing. Oh, that would have been amazing. That's a bummer.
Yeah, I mean, it's a thing. And, I kind of tout our attention to detail as well. And even for Street Fighter, like I'll give an example and I'll stop talking about Street Fighter because, I'm really proud of that example. There's a lot of things that I would fix in Street Fighter, but for what it is, I think it's a great release. But
it is. It's great.
When I went, yeah, thank you. When I went to, when I went to New Zealand on vacation early in like between the first and second years of college, I was a big Street Fighter. Obviously, it was the heyday of Street Fighter. I was big in Street Fighter. I went to New Zealand, and really all New Zealand was for the places that had Street Fighter 2 was whoever was the first to play Guile, and they would just do handcuffs and magic throws all over and over again, right? And so because of that, I had to get really good at that. And so, you would just get really good to being able to do magic throws, and no one can beat you doing that, right? So, and so when we did the collection, I wanted to be sure to include the ROM iteration that supports that, which we do. The problem with that is that as part of the Guile handcuff stuff is if you do a flash kick with the middle of the handcuffs, if you do a flash kick with the fierce and roundhouse, it reboots the system of the arcade cabinet. You can't have that in a game, a modern game. Like you can't have a situation where it reboots the game. It's a non-TRC compliant. So I know I want to keep it. So we went in and we actually went in and blocked that from happening. So when you do that, it doesn't reset the system. Most people will not know that stuff. I only share it from the standpoint that the attention to detail, again, that we tried to do, we go in and, instead of just like using a ROM iteration that doesn't have Guile's handcuffs and things like that, we fix the problem. And we still keep it in there for posterity and accuracy of that experience, but we go in and actually modify stuff. And I was so proud because when it went on the FGC circuit and they started demoing the game, the collection at fighting game conventions, one pro Street Fighter, the first thing he did, I wasn't there, but I was told this by the Capcom rep there, but he came there and he tried to do all the Guile stuff. And he's like, oh my God, it's like, it doesn't reset. And it's like, you guys actually changed this? He's like, yeah, we did. He's like, oh man, so it's like, I want people to sort of understand the amount of work and care and passion that goes into these collections. They aren't just ROMs thrown into a box. That's the first phase, right? Like you have to build the emulators. You get the games in there. That is step one. Anyone with enough time can do that. But that's day one for us, metaphorically speaking. The difference is all the stuff that we do for the rest of development. And it's things like that we spend such meticulous detail. Even Street Fighter, I had stopwatches and I was timing the emulation between different games with the arcade board. I had like so many arcade boards laying around me, and timing it with a stopwatch to, for trying to replicate accuracy and how fast the timers go and things like that. That's the stuff that people don't see, that keeps me up at night and stuff like that. But, we just continue to improve upon that and get better and better. And, we put so much of our heart and souls into these collections. And like I said, all we hope is that, people see that and they appreciate it when it comes out, and it goes and expands beyond just the core audience that might initially be interested in. And if that's the case, then I can sleep well at night that we've accomplished our goal.
Nice. Oh boy. All right, let's see here. I don't think I had any other major questions about existing products, more like hypotheticals. Like, I know I would love a Mega Man Legacy Collection 3, but I feel like Capcom's kind of doing their own thing with those, like with the Battle Network Connect collection they just released.
Right, yeah.
Right, yeah.
Or announced. If you were to do a Legacy Collection 3, like, what would you want on it?
Well, quite honestly, the big push that we would probably do is the Mega Man Legends, like the 3D games. That's what I would do. I kind of tweeted about that somewhat recently, and it kind of blew up because I'm like, oh, myself and like 2 other people at work would love to do a collection of those, and then see where the prototype for the last game was done, how far it got done, and either finish it or like release the prototype for it. And then obviously fix some control stuff and things like that. But I'd love to release those in a modern setting. That would sort of be my dream if I had any Mega Man, if I had an option to work on Mega Man again. I didn't work on the first Mega Man Legacy Collection. That was all Frank Savaldi and Kevin Wilson. But yeah, that would be sort of my dream.
I would love to see the at a certain point, Capcom was going to release Mega Man Mania for Game Boy Advance that colorized all the Game Boy games.
Oh, yeah.
I would love to see something like a proper colorized version of all the original Game Boy games would be awesome.
I keep wanting to do that. I wanted to do that, and I did a teeny bit with Disney Collection where we have the colorized versions of the Game Boy games. And I try to go in and spend time trying to figure out the best palette choices for each game, which is difficult because sometimes you're like, oh, the grass is green on this stage, that works, but then on here it makes the dirt look yellow. Like it makes it dirt, like it's weird because you have limited number of palette, right?
It's like using Super Game Boy on Mario Land, and like the first level looks great with this red, but then you get to the next level and all the water's red. Oh no!
Yeah. So my dream and that what I'd like to do for the future is actually build out a system so that per level or per section of the game, we could utilize a custom palette, and then we would detect, oh, you're on level 2 now. What's the new color palette? So that we wouldn't be stuck with the same color palette throughout the entire game. I keep talking about that. I haven't had a chance to sit down and figure it out yet, but that's what I would like to. I was sparked by your thoughts, but I would like to do that. If we do more Game Boy stuff, I would have done it on Turtles. There wasn't time, we didn't have it set up yet, but at some point I would like to have that set up so that we can take Game Boy, at least Game Boy games, and have like cool palettes, maybe even expand the number of colors, but colorize it and not have it locked for the duration of the game, but actually go in and determine what the best scenario is for each level and kind of go from there. I think that would be cool.
That would be cool. All right, last one for me, and it's not. It's not really a question. It's just a statement that I will say out loud as many times as I can to anyone who will listen. A Blaster Master collection. Just want to put that into the world.
Oh, Blaster Master?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's interesting. I mean, Blaster Master has had a bit of a resurgence. Like Limited Run Games has released the updated, like the updated stuff.
0, 1, 2, and 3. Awesome.
Yeah.
The first game gets re-released all the time, but 2 for Genesis and the PlayStation 1 have never been re-released ever. Same with Blaster Master Overdrive was a WiiWare exclusive. That's now completely unavailable ever.
Yeah, it's just so about that stuff. Yeah, that's unfortunate. I mean, there's at least one engineer I know who's a big Blaster Master fan, so I'm sure he'd love to work on that stuff. I don't know. I mean, it's a cool series for sure. I think that could do decently well, depending on the audience. You know what I actually want to do? You just remind me that, speaking of because there's so many iterations of it, it's like a Bomberman collection. I think there's so many versions of Bomberman, and as a party game, I think it'd do really well. And you could dig out, there's so many different platforms, even like the PC Engine TurboGrafx stuff, like the Saturns. You know what I mean? Like there's so many different versions. But Blastmaster is also, like I said, an IP that is sort of well loved. I don't know. I don't know if that will ever come across our desks, but we have at least
my
one
formal request.
Yeah.
Also, there's a Bomberman connection there because Blastermaster Boy was a port. Oh, it's like a weird reskinning of, was it Robo Warrior, which is a Bomberman spinoff.
There you go.
So there's your
connection. It's all coming together.
3
it all
degrees
makes
of Kevin
sense.
Bacon. Yeah, right. That's totally cool. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of collections that we want to do, and I think you'll start to see that, like, you know, we are moving beyond sort of the typical thing that we've done in the past, which is just work with a publisher and that's it. We're starting to do stuff on our own. We're actively, pursuing stuff that we want to do. And so I think, you know, in the future, you'll start to see more stuff that we're releasing ourselves outside, you know, not dependent on other companies. It'll be like IP that we license or we acquire or whatever and do it. So, people keep sending their suggestions for sure. We have a long list of things that we would definitely want to work on our own. And I'm sure some of that overlaps with what other people dream we would work on. So, we'll see. The years ahead are very exciting. This year is very busy, and I can only expect that each year after this is going to be even busier. I mean, the 2022 definitely by far as a studio is the and even last year, because most of Turtles development was last year, is hugely busy. And onward and upward, I guess I say.
Yeah. My last question, since you just kind of touched on it, right? Like there's dream stuff that people would want you to work on. What's yours? Pie in the sky, money is no obstacle, rights are no obstacle. What's the collection you want to do?
Man, that's a
and
hard
why
one.
Is it Metal Gear?
Yeah.
That's the one I want. Like, I want the Criterion Films collection, Metal Gear. Like,
Yeah.
I want and I can't imagine the amount of work that something like that would be, just from all of like the craziness of what Metal Gear is. But,
yeah.
I mean, if you could do one.
Yeah, that is a crazy one. The tough part about that, with Kojima being gone from Konami
Right.
now, it's like we'd want to talk to him, and I don't know how awkward that would. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think
it seems like it would be super awkward, just based on like interviews and stuff.
Yeah, so I find that would be a difficult. Like, we would have to talk with him, and I'm sure Konami probably wouldn't want that, and it'd just be ridiculous to have a collection of Metal Gear without his sort of impact or interviews and things, right?
You'd have to.
Yeah, so that's why I feel that wouldn't sort of necessarily work out. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I think about stuff. You know, recently what I would love to do, and I've always wanted this because I like these games, and this is a very small collection, but you guys know the Tokyo Disneyland games that were released on the Super Famicom? I don't know if you're familiar with them. Like, we had a lot of Disney games.
I've seen them, just never played them.
Yeah, we've got a lot of games in the United States from Disney, but there are these ones that are focused around Tokyo Disneyland. They were released by Tomy. They're never been localized or brought to the United States. I streamed them some years back as far as a Digital Eclipse stream and things like that, but I think they're really cool. I think that there's a fervor still for Disney IP and Mickey Mouse and those games, and a lot of people haven't been exposed to those old games. So, jumping back to kind of the Disney collection, if we did it somehow, I would love to like localize, kind of like what we did in the Blizzard Arcade Collection, where we went into the Ultimate versions and actually localized in-game the text
right.
for those old games. I would want to do that for those Japanese Tokyo Disneyland games, because I think they're very cool. They're hard, but they're very, very cool. They're just completely in Japanese, and there's just a whole part of the world that's never seen them, and I think that people would enjoy them. So I just think like this Ultimate Disney Collection with those localized would be a cool thing.
Awesome.
Oh, that'd be interesting.
That was a completely unexpected answer.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that. I was thinking about that recently. That's why it's at the top of my head. Like if you gave me more time, there's a variety of things that I'd like to do. I'd love to do like a Sega Saturn fighting game collection for Sega. That has all of the Saturn fighting games, Virtua Fighters, the Fighters Mega Mixes, Virtua Fighter Kids, Fighting, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
I would love to do that because
so
I'm a
cool.
fighting game sort of fan.
Or like Power Stone. Get that
yeah,
sort
or
of
even a
stuff in
Virtua
there.
Fighter collection of some sort.
Yeah.
I would love to do. There's a myriad of underappreciated games. My last thing that I would love to, which would be too difficult to do, is I'd love to go back and look at all the 18 and 16-bit, even 32-bit, kind of like one-hit wonder mascots.
That would be great. Yes.
You know what I mean? Like, so all of those games that had they were only at least one game or maybe two games that were these mascot games that they were just made up. Some of them have researches, like Robocod has researched, and Arrow the Acrobat has resurfaced. There's a ton of those games, and somehow getting them all in one collection, I think would be awesome. I think people that would be a guilty pleasure for people, like the spot games, avoid the Noid stuff, like all that stuff. Getting them in one collection, I think would be super silly but kind of fun, just a fun release. So that's something I always think of too, that I think would be kind of cool.
Well, if you have anyone at, I know you got a good relation with Konami. If you could just get them in some way to re-release anything Rocket Knight, that would be pretty grand too. It's just do the world a service and get Rocket Knight out there.
Yeah, Rocket Knight, right? Like I do talk with them about a lot of stuff. Like some of my favorite games in them are obscure stuff like Shadow of Destiny, Ring of Red. I always joke with Charles over there.
Shadow of Destiny is so good.
Shadow of Destiny is a weird game that no one played. Ring of Red is a strategy game that I really like that most people never really played. But there's a lot of IP that they have that they're starting to dig out of their vaults, and I'd love to continue conversations with them to see what sort of makes sense. I am hoping that Turtles is just the foot in the door, and that Konami loves it so much as well that we can start talking about other cool stuff, because they have so many IPs that they don't do anything with. Same as Sega. Sega utilizes their main IP like over and over again, but there's so much sub IP that would be really cool to do updated collections or games or new games, even, or demakes or whatever that I'd love to do. But you can only do so much in a year. So
I bring up Shadow of Destiny on this podcast every couple of weeks. Like I find some way to work it in and be like, no, you really need to play this game. It's fucking amazing. Like you have to play this game.
The endings, as far as like unlocking the endings and how the story unfolds and how the twists and some of that is great.
It's so cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, that game rules. Everyone should play it. See, there you go. So now we're good for the next couple of weeks, and then I'll find another way to work it in.
There you go. But yeah, that's sort of where we are. Thanks for everyone's support. Please look forward to Cowabunga Collection on August 30th. Atari in the very near future. We haven't announced a release date for that, but I'm sure a release date will be announced soon for that. And then we've got quite a few things in the works for post that. So, hang with us and, follow our journey, and hopefully you guys will continue to see some exciting stuff in the months and years ahead.
Outstanding. All right, let's see. We have one last question we ask of all of our guests. Before that, I will just say, if you can still find a way to sneak Flip out into that Atari collection, you'll make at least two people happy. But the stone, me and Ferg, who's the host of an Atari podcast, we're like the two people who like that game. All right, so here's the question we ask of all of our guests: what bread is the best bread?
Oh man. That's a tough one. I think it depends on sort of my mood. I like, what is this brand? There's this brand of bread that I can't, it's kind of like, it's like thick and it's like fluffy. And I don't remember, I think it's kind of like a brioche, but it's sliced. You know what I mean? It's like, that's my go-to sort of sandwich bread kind of scenario. Or for French toast, because it's kind of spongy and thick. But I don't know the brand that I prefer, but that's the type of bread that I prefer.
All right, good answer. I love it. All right, well, thank you very much for joining us. I think we've been at this for quite a while. We should probably wrap it up. Thanks for answering all our questions. You've been a joy to talk to. And yeah, I think that's all I got.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. Would love to chat with you guys in the future. It's been a blast as well, and sort of talking about the stuff we're working on and other things. So yeah, thanks for having me on.
Outstanding.
For sure, man.
And we're back. It's been like 3 hours.
I wasn't that. It was like 2.5. That's not bad, though.
No, not bad at all. I couldn't believe how many answers he was willing to give for a lot of these questions.
Yeah, for sure.
I definitely, when I finished writing all my Atari questions, I was like, this is too much. I should probably pare this back. But
That's honestly, I didn't even write any questions down. I was like, I'm just going to let Kris go, and we'll see kind of what happens if I can even get a word in edgewise.
Well, I'm glad you did, and that was a hoot. So
it was.
Yeah, I guess it's time to wrap it up. That is our show. Join us next week when we will be diving into our next Stone Age starter kit, this time on Nintendo 64. Right? That's what we're doing next week?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I gotta go recheck my prices, because I did it like the day after we did the PlayStation, and I had my list, but I just want to double check and see if anything dramatic has shifted, because this market is still so volatile. It's crazy.
Yes, it is. Well, I haven't even made my list yet, so I'm looking forward to it. At any rate, we are on most social media platforms. Yeah, it ain't me. If you want to get in touch with us, we aren't very difficult to find. All it takes is a quick look at our show notes, and you'll see links to our social media accounts, as well as all manner of other fun stuff, like a link to our namesake, StoneAgeGamer.com, the Geekade Patreon to keep this show running week after week, and more useful links than you can shake a joystick at. This show's theme song, Squared Roots, was written by Banjo Guy Ollie. You can learn all about his wonderful music and more by following the link to his YouTube channel, also in the show notes. And finally, as always, we'd like to thank our intrepid editor, Evan, for making the show listenable for all you folks, and we'd like to thank all you folks for listening in the first place. That's it, everybody. On behalf of Dan and myself, keep playing games.